A single mother with a big heart.
If you needed anything, she was always there.
She was a sweet girl. Everybody loved her.
Is the victim of a bizarre murder.
Duct tape had been wrapped around her head about 14 times.
This is nothing I had ever seen before or even heard of before.
Leaving her young son as the only witness.
A 4-year-old child had been just mere feet away, his mother being killed.
Investigators focus on the men in her life.
This guy, he wouldn't look at us. He was more nervous than normal.
And that polygraph test, he passed. It was frustrating as hell.
She was using Norma's house for these sexual liaisons.
To unveil a killer hiding in plain sight.
Of everyone we dealt with, he was maybe the coolest customer of the bunch.
People didn't see that inner demon. He was an unexpected killer.
It just blows you away.
Port Hueneme, California, a peaceful beach town on the Pacific coast.
It's a hidden gem. Port Hueneme is about 60 miles north of LA. It's a completely different environment. It's a lot more relaxed.
It's a quiet town, and it's a town that has, for a long time, a ridiculously low crime rate and very rarely a homicide.
But the tranquility of the seaside community is shattered one summer morning when police get an urgent call.
On June 1st, 1993, it was about 7 o'clock in the morning, our dispatch received a call of a possible homicide.
An ex-husband had called up and said that his ex-wife had been murdered.
We hadn't had a homicide in over 3 years. It took me a second to realize, okay, this is real.
Detectives arrive to begin the investigation, but nothing can prepare them for the scene inside.
I got inside the house, and then it was like, oh my God. This is just too bizarre for words. She's laying on the floor, head encased in duct tape. It had been partially cut away, but it appeared as though someone had tried to wrap her like a mummy.
It went from the top of her forehead to the chin.
It was just incredibly strange. This is nothing I had ever seen before or even heard of before.
And some rigor mortis had set in the back portion of her body because she was laying on the back. Usually rigor mortis takes a number of hours to show up. We estimated that the victim probably died in the early morning hours. When I saw that duct tape, the first thing that entered my mind was this was somebody she knew. Whoever did it didn't want to have her look at them while they were committing the crime.
Looking to unravel the mystery of this bizarre murder, detectives turn to the victim's ex-husband, who claims to have discovered the body.
At the house, the ex-husband was there, his brother was there, and 2 younger sons were there.
The ex-husband, Tony, identifies the victim as 32-year-old Norma Rodriguez, mother to 2 boys, Andrew, 11 years old, and Austin, 4 years old.
Tony, he said that he had come over to the house to pick up the kids to take them to school, which was his regular practice.
The 2 boys were still asleep in their beds when Tony realized what had happened to their mother. He told them to stay in their room until police arrived.
Tony, his brother Hector, and the 2 sons were transported to the Port Hueneme Police Department, where they were going to be interviewed separately. Tony and Hector were first at the house, and we needed to determine what happened.
Police continue to comb through the house looking for clues.
It was not a scene of extreme violence. There wasn't blood anywhere. There weren't a lot of things overturned.
In the bedroom, we located her purse, and it was intact. There wasn't anything that seemed to be missing.
This was not like a burglary that had gone wrong.
There's no sign of forced entry into the home. Then, something else catches the detective's eye.
I noticed a set of keys that were on the floor. They were in an unusual location, close to her body. We checked and confirmed they were Norma's house keys.
But why were Norma's keys lying next to her body? As investigators finish processing the scene, Norma's sister, Aralia, arrives.
I was supposed to pick her up because we were going to go looking for a car for her. And I had been calling her, and I drove to her house. That's when I saw the yellow tape. I saw the police department there, and that's what they told me would happen. And my worst nightmares, did I ever think that this would happen to my sister? It is horrible, horrible.
Norma Rodriguez was born and raised in rural Texas.
We're 7 sisters and 1 brother. She was the middle child, and, I was really close to Norma. She was very quiet, very reserved, a very big heart. If you needed anything, she was always there.
I first met Norma in 1975 in junior high school. We were 14 years old, and we became friends right away. Well, we used to hang out together and just go everywhere together. She could be feisty, but she was a sweet girl. Everybody loved her.
After high school, Norma moved to Oxnard, California for college and soon fell for another student named Tony.
She loved him. She just loved being with him.
Their college romance became more serious, and 2 years later in 1982, Tony popped the question. They soon had their first son, Andrew, and their second son, Austin, arrived 7 years later.
She was just a great mom. Norma was very devoted to her boys. Her boys were her life.
But in 1991, after almost 10 years together, Tony and Norma's marriage became strained.
Tony was really never around.
She was getting into arguments and fights with Tony, asking him to provide for them. She realized it would be an easier life for her if she just went on her own without Tony. And that's what she did.
Later that year, Norma moved with her sons to the neighboring town of Port Hueneme. She got a job at a local retail store and started a new chapter in her life.
Being a single mom, people might think that's a hard job. She enjoyed it. And it was hard for her, but she was happy.
Who would want to take the life of this loving mother, and in such a bizarre way? Later that day, at police headquarters, detectives begin to interview Norma's ex-husband, Tony Rodriguez, and his brother, Hector.
As the first 2 parties to the scene, the investigators had to look at them.
The detectives asked Tony about how he found Norma earlier that day.
Tony, he said that he had knocked on the door, but Norma didn't answer. Sons Andrew and Austin were asleep. The door was locked, so then he used a credit card in order to slip the lock, and he was able to open the front door.
When Tony and Hector entered the living room, they saw Norma lying on the floor, her face wrapped in duct tape.
Hector told us that he cut the tape because they didn't know whether she was deceased or not, and they wanted to try to make it easier for her to breathe. He's the one that had the scissors in his possession, and he's the one that decided to cut the tape off of her face.
We thought, wow, that's a little strange. Why is this guy doing this? Why is he messing up our evidence? Hector told us that the body was still somewhat warm. And that didn't make sense because by that time she had full rigor mortis. I mean, she had obviously been deceased for a number of hours. I just wasn't buying it.
Investigators are skeptical. Is Hector misleading police because the 2 men have something to hide? They hone in on Tony and Hector as possible suspects.
We don't know these people. We don't know what they're capable of.
Tony and Hector are suspicious. And Tony, being Norma's ex, he was right at the top of our list.
Coming up, detectives broaden their hunt for a possible killer.
We've got countless potential witnesses, countless potential suspects, interviews with co-workers.
We didn't know who it was. I just wanted him off the streets.
Investigators suspect a love interest from Norma's past has something to hide.
It was a brief but intense relationship.
It was that selfishness, that narcissistic quality that would cause him to end someone else's life.
And what police uncover shocks everyone.
All this time, were we dealing with a true sociopath and, couldn't see it?
Mother of two, Norma Rodriguez, has been found murdered with her head wrapped in duct tape. Less than 24 hours into the investigation, detectives are interviewing their first suspect, starting with her ex-husband, Tony Rodriguez.
In a case like this, statistics will show you that an overwhelming amount of the time, it's going to be that significant other or former significant other who ends up being your suspect.
Investigators ask Tony about his relationship with Norma in the weeks leading up to her death.
At the time, Tony said that they had been separated for a couple of years. I don't believe they had filed for divorce yet, but they were living separately, and Tony had visitation rights. They weren't close friends anymore, but they tried to maintain the friendship for the boys.
But police have a different account from Norma's family.
We learned that shortly before the homicide, there were some conflicts.
Norma, she was upset at the fact that he would come make excuses to come over with the boys, but he would end up wanting to stay there. She used to complain about that. I said, don't let him in. He doesn't have the right to come into your house. And she was a little timid when it came down to Tony.
According to loved ones, Tony couldn't accept that Norma was moving on. Detectives press him about his whereabouts in the hours surrounding Norma's murder.
Tony said that on May the 30th, early afternoon, he talked with Norma and asked if their son Andrew could stay with him. Tony had tickets to an Angels game the next day, and so they agreed that that was okay.
Tony says Andrew was dropped back home the next night. At the time, Tony never entered the house. He found Norma's body the next day. Did Norma's ex innocently walk into the crime scene that morning, or had something more sinister happened?
The potential motive with him was he wanted the kids. Maybe one thing led to another, and he lost control.
In a room nearby, police questioned Tony's brother Hector, since he was with him when Norma's body was found. They ask where he and Tony went after dropping Norma's son at his mom's.
Hector, he said that they had been at his residence with other family members in the city of Oxnard. And when we interviewed those family members, they corroborated what Tony and Hector told us.
Knowing their alibis are far from concrete, detectives ask Tony and Hector to take polygraph tests.
The results of the tests were that they were being honest in stating that they did not know anything about the homicide.
With no hard evidence to hold them, investigators are forced to let the two men go. News of Norma's death quickly spreads through the small community.
When I found out about her being murdered like that, I had told my cousin that I had just talked to her. It can't be true because I just talked to her. It was true.
At the police station, detectives receive the results of the autopsy.
The cause of death was established as manual strangulation. Norma wasn't a tiny woman. Whoever did this had to possess significant upper body strength.
Some important details emerge about the duct tape.
The length of it was approximately 20 feet and had been wrapped around her head about 14 times.
The duct tape was examined and there were skin cells that were discovered. But in 1993, DNA technology was in its infancy. You had to have a fairly significant sample size in order to potentially get a result from it. In Norma's case, they didn't have nearly enough in these samples.
To find out who did this, we have to dig deeper.
Searching for new leads, detectives hope Norma's 11-year-old son, Andrew, can help. With Tony's consent, the detectives talk with him at the station.
When you're interviewing any type of a witness, it's a difficult process. And you have to understand that when you're interviewing a child, it's extremely difficult. We interviewed Andrew, and we just wanted to try to get as much information as we could. From the date of the homicide, Andrew had gone to a baseball game with his father and his uncle. Later at night, Andrew was dropped off at the house, and the house was dark.
Andrew walked up to the front door, found it was locked. He went around to his bedroom, saw that the window was open, and crawled in.
Then, Andrew shares a disturbing detail told to him by his younger brother.
When Andrew came into the bedroom, 4-year-old Austin had said, "Mommy has a Band-Aid on her face." That didn't register immediately with Andrew, and so he went to bed. And it wasn't until morning that Andrew found out exactly what Austin meant by a Band-Aid. It just ripped at your heart knowing that a 4-year-old child had been just mere feet away from his mother being killed. And at one point he had come out, he had seen his mother's body. That just ripped at me a lot.
What else had Norma's youngest son, Austin, seen? Detectives decide to speak to the 4-year-old.
At first, he was withdrawn. He really didn't want to talk about it, which was understandable. I knew that because he's 4 years old, and I couldn't have gone on much longer than I did. And I knew that I needed to stop. But then he mentioned a man by the name of Corey.
He brought up the name Corey as someone who was over at the house at that time. Now we've got this person who might end up being our prime suspect.
But who was Corey? Had he killed Norma? Did the single mom's youngest son just solve her murder?
We've got to run it down as far as it goes.
Police are investigating the bizarre murder of single mother Norma Rodriguez. Her youngest son, Austin, says he saw a man named Corey at their home around the time of the murder.
At that time, we had no idea who Corey was, but it was something that had to be checked out.
Detectives learn from the family that Corey could be Corey Davis, one of Norma's co-workers. So they head to her workplace.
First step was find out, to what extent Corey knew Norma, if they socialized, if they were friends away from work, and so forth.
Corey was more nervous than normal. In talking with him, he wouldn't look at us. He kept staring down, not tuning in or paying attention.
Corey's unusual behavior during their conversation alarms investigators.
He did not like being talked to and having to answer anything.
They question Corey about his relationship with Norma.
He stated that he would interact with Norma at work, but they weren't that close with each other, and they didn't have any interactions beyond that.
Detectives want to know if he was at Norma's house near the time of her murder, as young Austin claimed.
He made it pretty clear that he wasn't at the house at that time. Instead, he said the night of the homicide he was at home. The only people who were there at home with him were his parents. We needed to find out how much of what he was telling us was, provably true.
While officers are sent to check Corey's alibi, detectives speak to Norma's other coworkers, starting with her friend, Beatrice.
Beatrice came to Norma's house on Sunday, the day before the homicide. Norma had a get-together, a small barbecue at her house for several of her co-workers.
Police ask Beatrice if she remembers anything unusual about the day of the barbecue.
Beatrice said that while she was there, suddenly Norma can't find her keys anymore. And they ended up searching all over Norma's house, trying to figure out what happened to Norma's keys.
They didn't find them, and then they're laying beside her body, beside her house at the time she's found. We figured someone had taken her keys, and that's how they were able to enter the house.
It's a significant lead. Does this mean the killer stole the keys at Norma's barbecue? Detectives renew their focus on her inner circle.
From everything we knew, this was a pretty personal crime. We had a certain confidence that the killer knew Norma.
At the police station, investigators discover information they received from Corey Davis has some holes.
One of the things we do with everyone is we find out what their addresses are, their date of birth, everything else. And with Corey Davis, one of the things we noticed was that his address he gave us was not the address where he was actually living. So there was a discrepancy there.
Why would Corey withhold that information from detectives? They wonder what else he's hiding.
But at this point in time, Corey jumped out at us as this is the one we need to concentrate on.
Police bring Corey in for an interview, but he's far from helpful.
He's like, well, I don't want to be involved in this. Well, I understand that, but like it or not, you are part of this case. If you want to be eliminated from the suspect pool, the best way to do that is to cooperate with us.
Detectives share details of the crime with Corey to observe his reaction.
With the information that we were giving to him, he was obviously upset, and he took it really hard.
Corey denies any involvement in Norma's death. They ask him to take a polygraph test.
He submitted to the test, and he passed.
All detectives have tying Corey to the crime scene is a statement from Norma's 4-year-old son. But police know he could be mistaken, given his young age and traumatic experience.
At that point, Corey worked his way down the ladder of possible suspects dramatically.
1 week into the investigation, detectives are out of leads. They look at who else was at Norma's barbecue the day before she was killed. Friends tell them about a former coworker named Warren Mackey.
Warren Mackey was a previous co-worker of Norma's, and also he lived in fairly close proximity to her.
Warren and Norma hit it off and became friends.
They worked together for a while, and the work relationship became a social relationship. It appeared that Warren had something more than just a friendship interest in Norma.
I remember Norma telling me that there was a guy there that she used to work with, and he was always trying to talk to her and trying to ask her out.
Talking to Norma's coworkers, detectives learned that Warren pursued Norma, but she wasn't interested in him romantically.
Norma told Beatrice and some of the other people that she felt that Warren wanted more than to be friends, and that she wasn't interested in that. She tried to curtail any attempts that he may have made to ask her out. Some of the employees that we talked with felt that Warren wasn't real pleased with that. He liked Norma, and that he wanted the relationship a little bit more than what it was.
But Norma still tried to maintain their friendship.
She noticed he was kind of like an outcast, just very private. So she tried to include him in the group. She didn't want to leave him out.
As detectives look closer at the quiet coworker, the information they uncover is concerning.
Started picking up little details about him at that point. There were some people who said, yeah, good guy, he was okay to work with. But there were enough people who pointed out that he was a little weird and had made some overtures to Norma, enough to make us want to look into this a little further.
But did Warren's workplace crush make him a killer?
The nature of their relationship was of interest to us. We're going to have a conversation with Warren Mackey.
Police investigating the murder of single mother Norma Rodriguez are questioning her former coworker, Warren Mackey. Detectives have learned that Warren may have been more than a doting colleague. They're trying to determine if he's connected to this brutal crime.
In our first encounter with Warren Mackey, there was nothing that seemed overtly suspicious or evasive or anything about him.
Detectives ask Warren about his feelings for Norma.
The impression that Warren Mackey gave us was that, his relationship with Norma Rodriguez was pretty casual. They didn't see quite as much of each other because they were no longer working with each other, but they socialized a lot.
Warren said that they were close, but it was only a close friendship. He never had romantic feelings for Norma.
He had tried to present himself to Norma as someone to lean on, someone to talk to. I'm here for you.
But investigators aren't fully buying it.
We felt that Warren liked Norma and that he wanted to make the relationship closer than it already was.
Then, Warren reveals a detail that grabs investigators' attention.
He had helped out Norma with, a couple little things around the house. And one of the things that he mentioned was that the kids had a small basketball hoop and it had somehow gotten broken and that he had fixed it. And what really kind of set off an alarm was the fact that he had fixed it with duct tape.
This is the first time in the investigation that anybody's mentioned duct tape or someone possessing duct tape.
Detectives drilled down on when Warren last saw Norma.
Warren said that he had been in the presence of Norma at the barbecue the day before the homicide. By the time things had wrapped up for the evening, it was essentially just him and Norma there, and they had just kicked back and watched TV for a while. This made him one of the last people who could have or would have seen Norma alive.
Had the former coworker made advances on Norma, then attacked her when she turned him down? Detectives ask where Warren was on the night of the murder.
Warren said that on May the 31st, close to Norma's homicide, he and his roommate and his roommate's girlfriend, they went to a nightclub in Santa Barbara till about 1:30, and then they came back to where they were living at in Oxnard. They talked for a short while, and then everybody went to bed. We drove to Oxnard, and we ended up talking with his roommate and her girlfriend who had gone with him for the night, and they corroborated his story as far as them going to Santa Barbara, closing the nightclub, and then getting back probably between 1:30 and 2 in the morning.
Could Warren have had time to drive to Port Hueneme and kill Norma after arriving home from a late night out with friends? Warren agrees to take a polygraph.
And he passed it, stating that he knew nothing about the homicide and he knew no one who would have killed her.
With nothing concrete tying him to the crime, police let Warren go. But before he leaves, Warren remembers Norma had problems with a man she was dating almost a year ago, named Daniel Garcia.
As the investigation continued, we started interviewing a number of people about Daniel. We found out that Daniel Garcia was Norma's boyfriend for a short period of time.
They met at a party. Norma had a strong attraction to the charming mechanic.
It was a brief but intense relationship, lasted a few months.
She told me about Daniel, that she really cared about him a lot. They would do fun things together, and she always had a good time with him.
Friends tell police Daniel ended the relationship, blindsiding Norma.
Daniel had approached Norma and essentially told her that he wanted to go back with a former girlfriend. But Norma was affected quite a bit by the breakup.
Then, detectives learned that the relationship was turbulent.
There was some fraying in the relationship, and there were some conflicts. Now, that sends up some big red flags. There was one coworker who mentioned that they had witnessed a fairly heated argument between Norma and Daniel.
Daniel came in while she was working. For whatever reason it started, they had a verbal altercation that was witnessed by other people. It shows there was hostile feelings on the part of Daniel Garcia.
When detectives dig deeper into Daniel and Norma's relationship, they learn he visited Norma at home about 2 weeks before her murder.
Norma confided to her close friend she was involved with him before her death.
With a history of conflict in the relationship, did an argument turn deadly?
This is big. Any big fight that went on, that was problematic.
Detectives are closing in on their new suspect.
This could be our guy. We have to find out if he could have committed this crime.
The investigation into the murder of single mother Norma Rodriguez is heating up. Police have a new suspect in their sights, an ex-boyfriend, Daniel Garcia.
One of the things that we learned about the relationship between Daniel and Norma was that there were some conflicts. That sends up some red flags.
Daniel agrees to come to the police station for questioning.
Norma really had no confrontations. She was very mild-mannered. The fact that she was getting into verbal altercations was unusual.
When detectives ask Daniel about his relationship with Norma, he denies any problems.
Daniel said that he wanted to go back with a former girlfriend. And so they broke up and went their separate ways. But they were still able to be somewhat friends, and he would stop by on occasion.
Detectives confront him about the heated argument with Norma at her workplace almost a year earlier.
At the time, Norma learned that he had had other relationships, and it was a problem. She was pretty upset by that.
She still had feelings for Daniel.
Had Norma attempted to restart their relationship, but instead wound up in a fight that spiraled out of control.
During his interview, Daniel told us that he saw Norma but didn't have an argument.
Detectives asked Daniel where he was the night Norma was killed.
He stated that he was at home with other family members watching TV, and then he went to bed. We talked with other family members, and that alibi was corroborated, but family members will lie for other family members. Sometimes they won't be perfectly honest with what they know, and it's extremely difficult to put weight on that.
Like previous suspects, Daniel is subjected to a polygraph.
And he passed.
With no evidence connecting the ex-lover to the crime, police let him go. It's another disappointing dead end.
After a couple of weeks of going through this, talking to countless potential witnesses, countless potential suspects, neighborhood canvasses, interviews with co-workers, polygraph examinations, it was frustrating as hell.
That was really, really hard on my family. We did not have an answer to who killed Norma. I just wanted not only justice for Norma, I was very concerned for any woman out there. We didn't know who it was. It could be someone that just passed me by. I didn't know. I just wanted him off the streets.
1 month into the investigation, the pressure continues to mount on police to solve the case.
We would get calls from the media every day. Every place we went in the community, they would ask us what was going on, and it was a lot of pressure.
Then, a surprising development. Norma's family contacts police with new information about Beatrice, Norma's coworker and friend.
It turns out that Beatrice was having an affair, and she was using Norma's house as a location for these sexual liaisons. Norma knew about it and in fact condoned it and gave her a copy of her house key.
But why hadn't Beatrice disclosed this detail to police earlier?
We confronted Beatrice with this information. Initially, huge wave of embarrassment. But she laid it out on the line. She told us, the when, the how many times.
Detectives question whether the secret rendezvous led to Norma's murder.
Now we've got other people who had, either continued access to the house. Previously, they were on the periphery of this case. Now they've moved right to the center of it.
One person detectives immediately turn to is Beatrice's husband, who also knew Norma. Had he gone after Norma for helping his wife have a secret affair?
Now, suddenly, Beatrice's husband, he's potentially in the suspect pool. We have to find out if he has an alibi and if we can corroborate it.
He apparently didn't know his wife was having an extramarital affair in Norma's house.
That was not the most comfortable thing to do from an investigative standpoint, but it still had to be done. And, the guy was crushed. He was absolutely crushed.
Detectives question Beatrice's husband about his whereabouts on the night of Norma's murder.
He told us that he had been at work late that evening. We talked to a lot of his coworkers. Everything about this man was genuine.
6 months into the investigation of the murder of Norma Rodriguez, detectives worry the trail has gone cold.
We're no closer to narrowing it down than we were on day one.
This case was very mind-boggling. You build up things that, wow, this is going to be great, it's coming together, and then it falls apart. As time progressed, the lead started falling off. It was tough. It was really tough.
Months turn to years. For nearly a decade, the case is at a standstill. But Norma's family doesn't give up.
Every year, we would call the police department for any updates, any new leads or anything. We kept it active. We didn't want this case forgotten.
During this entire investigation, I had the picture of Norma Rodriguez on my desk. I swore to her that I would never give up trying to find out who was responsible.
Then, 10 years to the day Norma was killed. An astonishing break in the case.
Worker with a crime lab. He had a lot of the evidence that we secured in the Norma homicide. He called me and he says, we have a match. We have a match on the DNA.
My head just like exploded with 1,000 thoughts. It was just nuts.
I remember receiving the phone call and it was like winning the lottery.
It's been 10 years since 32-year-old Norma Rodriguez was found in her home, strangled and wrapped in duct tape. The case has remained unsolved, with all leads turning out to be dead ends, until now. With advancements in DNA technology, evidence collected a decade ago has finally yielded results.
At the time of the autopsy of Norma Rodriguez, there were a number of samples that were taken. Hair samples, blood samples, and fingernail clippings.
The crime lab said we have a match on the DNA, and it comes back to Warren Mackey.
Warren, Norma's friend and former coworker who had previously passed a polygraph and had an alibi for the night of the murder. At the time of the investigation, Warren had submitted his DNA and was cooperative.
Of everyone we dealt with, he was maybe the coolest customer of the bunch. It just blows you away.
Investigators start putting the pieces together about Warren Mackey.
If you're dealing with someone who's a true sociopath, they can get past the polygraph test. So now I'm thinking, all this time, were we dealing with a true sociopath and, couldn't see it?
We just went into high gear. We started unraveling everything again and doing what we needed to do.
Detectives start building a case based on forensics.
They evaluated DNA that we had gotten off of Norma's body, and we found Warren's DNA under Norma's fingernails.
The DNA evidence is a major breakthrough, but to build an airtight case, they want more.
The single biggest piece of physical evidence we had at the time was the duct tape. So it got sent off and it got tested.
The DNA that was obtained within the multiple layers of the duct tape was returned to Warren Mackey.
The odds of the DNA match being from someone else besides Warren Mackey was 1 in 810 billion. So we felt pretty confident that this was our person.
Investigators pieced together the events that led up to Norma's murder.
I think this was the classic case of a jilted suitor. And my guess is that he just got a flat-out rejection. He built up his expectations to a point where he couldn't take the fall.
Investigators believe in the early hours of May 31st, Warren Mackey entered Norma's home using keys he had stolen from her purse at the barbecue the day before.
According to Norma's son, Andrew, the house was dark. Many times she would fall asleep watching TV. Maybe she fell asleep on the couch. She had no idea what was about to happen.
Detectives believe that's when Warren strangled Norma.
In his mind, she needed to die because she shouldn't have rejected him.
Then Warren wrapped her head in duct tape.
Trying to depersonalize the scene and covered her face so that he wouldn't see it.
And he ripped that duct tape, handling both ends of the duct tape, wrapped it completely around her face, and left.
Police also believe Norma's 4-year-old son, Austin, was in the next room, not realizing his mother had been murdered.
Austin didn't process, because he was a very small child, that he was too young to process what had happened. An absolute nightmare.
After Warren kills Norma, he returns to his place in nearby Oxnard, as if nothing happened.
I believe that Warren Mackey was the type of person who felt that if I can't have her, nobody can. I think this was one sick individual who had no value for life. He had no right to do what he did.
On August 28, 2003, Ventura County investigators arrest Warren Mackey for the first-degree murder of Norma Rodriguez. Warren pleads not guilty.
During the subsequent 10 years, Warren had settled down. He had gotten married, had a job, was living a very stable life. His friends, neighbors said that he was a nice, caring man.
And for him to live 10 years after that and not even have any remorse, that is not human. I can't imagine what is in a person's head to even hurt another human in that way.
Then, on January 10, 2005, as investigators prepare for trial, the DA receives an unexpected call. Warren Mackey has changed his plea to guilty.
Warren Mackey is an unexpected killer because people didn't see that inner demon, that selfishness, that narcissistic quality that would cause him to end someone else's life. People just didn't see him that way, but he was that way, and he is that way.
On March 28, 2005, Warren Mackey is sentenced to 15 years to life for the murder of Norma Rodriguez.
Oh, it was phenomenal. It was such an elation. You felt like this weight being lifted.
At the end of the day, we achieved closure for the family, but there's never going to be complete closure.
The devastating loss of the vibrant single mother will forever be felt by her loved ones.
I think about Norma a lot. She was having a good life, and he took it away from her.
It still hurts like it happened yesterday. I miss her in my life. That wound does not heal. We just put it in the back burner. We have to live for Norma, and we have to go forward.
A loving husband and father with so much to live for.
He did everything for his family. He was an amazing daddy. He loved life. He loved to be happy.
Is ruthlessly gunned down at home in front of his wife.
When he was laying there on the floor, nothing can prepare you for that.
They stood over the victim's body with a shotgun and delivered a fatal blow.
This wasn't just a random killing. This was an assassination.
Police tracked down several suspects.
She was absolutely the possible person who was involved. She had all the motive.
He began bragging about other involvements that he had had with acts of violence.
And we knew that he and the victim had some bad blood between them.
Just when police think they might never catch the killer,
we were pretty frustrated, and the wind was kind of taken out of our sails.
The case takes a mind-blowing turn.
She sang like a songbird.
He had been in possession of the guns used.
And law enforcement was pretty stunned by that. to reveal a killer no one imagined.
This is unbelievable.
It was someone that if you passed on the street would look as innocent as they come.
The darkest, blackest soul.
Known for its white sand beaches, Panama City lies on the Gulf Coast of Florida's Panhandle.
Our biggest industry is tourism, with millions of people coming to enjoy the Gulf Coast.
The community is very tight. You know most of your neighbors, you know everybody that you do business with on a personal name basis.
But in the early hours of October 6, 1998, the town's sense of safety is rocked by a chilling 911 call.
At 3 o'clock in the morning, there was a call from a woman that her husband had been shot and killed.
There was a lot of shots. I ran back to the bedroom. The killer wasn't in the house. He was coming after us. I literally thought everybody was gonna die, and I was so scared.
Police raced to the home, expecting to encounter an active shooter.
Their first thought is clearing that house, making sure that the killer's not still in the house.
As the officer entered, the first thing that he noticed was the victim's body in the kitchen area.
When they started calling out that they were the police and they were there, the wife was in a bedroom.
She had retreated to seek safety for her and her children, which were still in the house.
This is all just happening so quickly. I don't know how I'm supposed to trust that whoever's out there is not the killer.
Officers find no sign of the gunman and assure Angelica it's safe to come out of the bedroom.
The wife came out and she was very, very hysterical.
When they walked me back out, when he was laying there on the floor, I knew he was gone. You have somebody murdering your husband and shooting you, all in seconds. Nothing can prepare you for that.
Angelica identifies the man as her husband, 30-year-old Ron Stovall.
The children were taken to Ron's parents' house. They didn't live too far away. And the victim's wife went to the police department where we could talk to her.
With Angelica and the children out of harm's way, detectives can examine the crime scene.
As a responding detective, I go in and start looking around. Ron, the victim, he had been shot 3 times in the back, once in the hip, and there was a shot to the back of the head.
Investigators find an important clue close to the victim's body.
There were some bloody footprints there on the floor. Part of those footprints had what looked like the letter H, 2 H's kind of next to each other on the sole.
Whoever was wearing that shoe had perpetrated at least part of the crime because they would have been standing in the victim's blood and then exiting the residence following the homicide.
The Stovall's front door also reveals how the murder unfolded.
We could see her husband was shot outside, and then the killer shot through the door, and he got into the house, and he had shot Ron in the back of the head.
As daylight breaks, a forensic team scours the outside of the home.
They found a handgun projectile out on the sidewalk near the driveway.
The killer shot what clearly looks like a handgun round to the lower extremities, and then you have a shotgun round to the head. This was overkill. They stood over the body and delivered a fatal blow. When you see that type of crime scene, you're looking immediately for someone that displayed some type of grudge or emotional hatred for the victim.
While forensics wrap up their investigation at the crime scene, detectives head to the police station to speak with Ron's wife, Angelica.
We really took note how emotionally overtaken she was, but she had been an eyewitness to this scene, so she was critical in our investigation.
I can't even comprehend what's going on. He was dead. I did not want to live without him. Ron was truly amazing. He was always full of life, very kind, sincere, very real.
Born in Panama City, Ron Stovall was one of 4 siblings.
He was very close with his family. He was always out doing stuff with school, doing stuff with the church.
He was well known within the community.
Ron served almost 4 years in the Navy. He had felt a commitment to his country and enjoyed his naval service.
Ron always dreamt of having a family, and in 1989, he met his first wife, Tina Trexler.
Tina and Ron got married, and they had one child, they had a daughter.
The marriage was a rocky one, and after 6 years, it fell apart. Soon after, Ron met single mom Angelica at a local beach bar.
He said he knew from the second he saw me that he loved me. Our first night, we went on a date, took me to the beach, to the ocean, put out a blanket, listened to some Marvin Gaye, had Italian food. It was very romantic. He stole my heart, and I was never in love before. I just fell right into his arms.
In 1997, the couple married. Just like Ron, Angelica had a child from a previous relationship. A year later, their family of 4 became 5 when they had a daughter of their own.
Ron took on several jobs. He worked as a waiter. He worked as a delivery man for the UPS companies.
He was very dedicated, and he just got his massage therapy license. He did everything for his family. We were very happy.
Who would want to gun down this loving husband and father in cold blood? At the station, Angelica tells police how the murder unfolded.
I was able to tell the cops everything I knew, and I didn't try to hold anything back. Ron got up at about 3 o'clock every morning, and I would get up and make his lunch for him to take to work.
She explains how Ron left the house and was suddenly ambushed.
There were some shots. I didn't know what was going on. He collapsed on the ground, and the killer tried coming through the door, so I was fighting with him. He got his hand through it. I grabbed the gun, and he opened the door with his hand, and I looked down that barrel of that silver gun, and he shot it.
The bullet just misses Angelica.
I ran back to the bedroom.
As Angelica shares more details about the deadly attack, detectives gain important information about the killer.
She described him as male, brown eyes, brown hair, and that he had some type of facial hair, possibly a mustache. She indicated hearing the assailant say to Ron as he was delivering the fatal gunshot wound, "This is for her."
It sounded very evil.
Angelica tells police she doesn't know the meaning behind the killer's words.
We need to find out who her was, and we needed to find out what made this so personal to her.
Well, this wasn't just a random killing. This was an assassination, is what it was.
Investigators ask Angelica who might want Ron dead.
Immediately, she went to Tina, his ex-wife. Ms. Stovall indicated that the relationship between Ron and his ex-wife was volatile. There was a custody issue over their daughter.
Things got a little bit more sticky with the custody setup, and Ron was filing for full custody of the child.
Could the bitter custody battle have turned deadly?
This was an enormous red flag for us as a team. Whoever her was may have in fact had to do with his ex-wife.
It's probably one of the worst situations we ever deal with, is with the man and woman and children involved. It will just about make a person do anything.
Coming up, police uncover a key piece of evidence.
He brings out a shotgun round that is similar to the one that we've recovered from our crime scene,
leading to a disturbing plot.
The photo identification that made him a prime suspect.
It was his eyes. What I saw was the same person.
And a sickening betrayal no one saw coming.
They planned this whole thing.
None of us had ever worked a case like this.
I do not understand how somebody can have so much hatred.
Police investigating the cold-blooded shooting of 30-year-old Ron Stovall are looking into his relationship with his ex-wife, Tina Trexler.
We knew that there was an extreme amount of tension between Ron and his ex-wife, and there was a custody battle that was forthcoming.
Ron and Tina originally shared custody, but Ron had filed a petition basically saying that he wanted full custody of the child.
Up to this point, Tina was that individual that had the most to gain from Ron's death. Perhaps she had not been the one on scene, but it still doesn't eliminate her as having some type of involvement.
This looked like certainly an intentional and a premeditated killing. Might have been a killing for hire.
Detectives speak to Ron's friends and family to get a clearer picture of the animosity with Tina.
When Ron remarried, it was okay, but not really okay. Tina, as well as her family, did not like the new wife, and the situation deteriorated between all of them.
As Ron and Angelica's family grew, Tina's behavior appeared increasingly erratic.
Tina began feeling that Ron was trying to work Tina out of the picture as the mother, and so that had really kind of amplified the rub and the tension.
There was all this, crazy fighting, and it was too hard for his daughter. We were just concerned.
This custody hearing was coming up in about 2 or 3 weeks from when this incident happened.
Tina was absolutely a possible person who was involved in this murder. She had all the motive.
Could the custody battle have driven Ron's ex-wife to murder? Investigators bring Tina in for an interview.
One of the things that was most alarming when we sat down with Tina was that there was no remorse, no emotional activity on her part, that she was even concerned that he was dead.
When investigators ask about her relationship with Ron, Tina's answer is surprising.
We knew there were a lot of hostilities, but when Tina was interviewed, she kind of painted that the relationship with them was cordial, it was friendly. It's a red flag for us as investigators because she's already showing signs of deceit.
With suspicions raised, detectives grilled Tina about her whereabouts in the hours leading up to Ron's murder.
She told us the night before the homicide, she had went to work at a local restaurant. She was a bartender. She got off sometime between 11 and midnight. She had went home and sat and watched TV with her mother. Then after that she had went to bed, and at the time of the homicide itself, she had been home asleep.
Before police can press Tina further, the interview is interrupted.
Her mother had hired a lawyer for her.
The attorney made contact with Tina and immediately ended the interview.
Unable to finish questioning Tina, detectives look into her alibi.
Police were able to establish that she had been at work that night till 11:30, 12 o'clock.
Investigators also speak with Tina's mother, Ann Trexler.
She was the grandmotherly type and was helping Tina get back on her feet and help her get through this divorce.
And come across as a very down-to-earth, nice lady, a housewife, and she confirmed that Tina had been at the house with her watching TV.
Though Tina's alibi checks out, police still theorize that she could have hired someone to kill her ex-husband.
We conducted a preliminary investigation into her financial records. Everything was consistent with that of just a working-class individual making normal purchases.
1 week into the investigation with no concrete evidence pointing at Tina, police look for other suspects. They quickly discover Tina wasn't the only one in a dispute with Ron.
Tina had a boyfriend. His name was Adrian Harris, and there had been some confrontations between Ron and Mr. Harris regarding the way Ron was treating Tina. And in fact, at one point, there had been some threats made on Harris's part.
Had Adrian decided to confront Ron, leading to deadly consequences.
As we began looking into Mr. Harris, whether he was paid to do it or whether he did it on his own, we weren't sure, but the concern was that he may have perpetrated this to make good with Tina for the purpose of helping her.
Investigators tracked down Adrian over 900 miles away near Baltimore.
When we talked with Adrian, he did acknowledge that there was some bad blood between the two of them, but he really kind of downplayed the significance.
The day of the murder, he told us he went to work.
He had clocked in before 7:30, and the time of Ron's death was 3:30 in the morning.
Detectives checked travel times between Baltimore and Panama City.
There was not enough time to get to Panama City from several states away to do the murder and go back home.
While Adrian is ruled out, someone close by catches the investigators' attention.
We talked to his roommate, Guy McInville.
When the officers went to talk to Adrian's roommate, they discovered the description of the killer that Angelica gave to law enforcement. The roommate fitted quite well.
Guy McInville had brown eyes, brown hair, and he had a mustache. Now we had another individual that we want to look at.
Once we saw him, Guy fit the description. He was a roommate with Adrian Harris, and we knew that Harris and the victim had some bad blood between them. We thought maybe he went there to kill him.
Is this the break police have been hoping for? Investigators rush to confirm if Guy is a true match for the gunman.
We got pictures of him to show the victim's wife, Angelica. See if he could have been the one that she saw that night.
Back in Panama City, detectives include the picture of Guy into a photo lineup.
Angelica was an essential witness.
She was a witness who can identify the individual that did the crime. Her photographic identification, it was surprising.
It has been 2 weeks since 30-year-old father, Ron Stovall, was shot to death at home in front of his wife, Angelica. Now, detectives hope she can identify the shooter from a photo lineup.
She picked out Guy McInville as being the killer.
It was his eyes. There was something very, very similar. What I saw was the same person.
There was an identification of Guy McInville that made him a prime suspect.
We have Miss Stovall's positive identification of Guy as the individual that was in front of their house. There's a sense of relief that begins to sweep through the unit because you're finally on to really developing hot lead. We want to now try to establish what type of physical evidence do we actually have between the victim, Ron, and Guy.
Detectives get a search warrant and race over to Guy's Baltimore residence. They make a telling discovery.
We search his items, and looking at me right square in the face was a pair of shoes consistent with the shoe impression that we had at the scene. So we're moving in the right direction.
Police bring Guy to the local police station for questioning.
Although we still were missing the key pieces of evidence, the guns and such as that, we really felt like we're starting to put together the edges of the puzzle. In speaking with Guy, what he provided us for an alibi was that he was in Maryland working. At the end of work, he went home, slept. The next day he got up, went to work, and so that was his alibi.
Detectives check out Guy's story.
We had had an opportunity to speak with Guy at his place of employment, and we were able to collect some video that correlated with his timeline of what he said. There was physically no way possible for him to have been here in Panama City at the time of the crime.
It turned out that what Guy McInville said to the police was correct. Guy had an alibi.
Eager to further prove his innocence, Guy volunteers to take a polygraph.
He successfully passed that. So we were able to clear Mr. McInville.
For police, it's a disappointing setback.
We were pretty frustrated, and it's a roller coaster. It's one of those, now you're back in the lows again, and the wind was kind of taken out of our sails.
Angelica wanted to help the officers along, but her perception at the time of the event was clouded by the terror, the trauma of the incident itself.
I remember him being the same person. It stuck in my head like that, but I was wrong.
It's difficult when you see something that quick that you can say, okay, this is the individual that did the crime.
We thought we had this thing solved, but you just got to go regroup, see what you still have to do, and you just start from there.
Desperate for new leads, investigators review Ron's autopsy report.
The autopsy confirmed 2 different weapons. They told us that it was a .357 round that he had been shot with, plus the shotgun shell. One big thing we learned was that shotgun residue got in his face. We think that Ron was laying there on the floor, and this guy's saying this is for her, and he presses that shotgun to the back of his head, and Ron's looking at him when that went off.
The forensics report contains another crucial detail that could lead police to the killer.
These were close proximity rounds, and so we knew that this was something personal. And the shotgun shell was paramount. It was a unique round. We would be able to identify it. So that was a plus in our corner.
Detectives shared details of the firearms with local law enforcement, hoping to track down their owner.
We work so closely with the different police departments in the area. We talk to them all the time in case something turns up.
As investigators continue to search for answers, Ron's loved ones struggle with their grief.
The best thing in my life was that life. I didn't think I was strong enough to go through anything without him. He was always full of life. Losing your soulmate, you can't even explain how much pain that was. It still is. It'll never go away.
3 weeks after Ron's murder, the investigation is threatening to grow cold, but then police receive a tip that reignites the case.
We got a call from the Panama City Beach Police Department. They had a home invasion out there on the beach. During that arrest, they recovered 2 handguns and a short-barreled shotgun.
They knew from the investigation of the crime scene where Ron Stovall was killed that a shotgun had been used and that a handgun had been used.
That coincides with what we're looking for. We wanted to go over the evidence they had and the circumstances.
Could these be the weapons connected to Ron's murder?
The gentleman that they arrested, we started looking into him and looking at his background and everything. And he had a pretty lengthy criminal history, had actually been linked to some murders in the past. He really caught our attention. This turned out to be a big break.
Police in Panama City are investigating the cold-blooded homicide of husband and father, Ron Stovall. They now believe the missing murder weapons were used in a home invasion robbery, less than 15 miles away.
When meeting with this investigator from the Beach Police Department, what he produced from his crime scene was this: a handgun and a sawed-off shotgun. That coincides with what we're looking for. Then he brings out a shotgun round that is similar to the one that we've recovered from our crime scene. We have everything that meets the parameters. Now we really believe we're on the right path.
The weapons are sent off to the crime lab. While detectives await the results, they dig deeper into this new lead.
At the Beach Police Department, they identified the individual as Tony Alberto Perez. He went by Tony. He had an extensive criminal history. There was some acts of violence in his past, or some drugs in his past. They really felt like he was a pretty violent individual.
Another detail catches their attention.
Tony had brown eyes, brown hair, and facial hair. He looks just like our guy. He met Miss Stovall's physical description to a T.
Investigators head to the nearby jail where Tony is being held for the home invasion.
He come across as a kind of a likable guy. He was laughing and cutting up, but the more he talked, the more red flags went up. He began bragging about other involvements that he had had with acts of violence. He was completely nonchalant about it.
Detectives turn up the heat and ask Tony if he killed Ron Stovall.
Tony totally denied any involvement, any knowledge of Ron, any knowledge of anything that may have happened on that date, and basically told law enforcement, it's not me, I'm not the person.
Despite Tony's denials, investigators believe he's withholding information, and they obtain a search warrant.
Tony Perez had items that he owned stored at the landlord's house, and we're searching through Tony Perez's items over there. And then we find a pair of work boot type shoes.
While inspecting the footwear, detectives notice a key detail.
Those work boots had what looked like the letter H, two H's kind of next to each other on the sole. It looked like what we had found at the crime scene. And we got those sent right off to the lab.
As police hunt for more incriminating evidence against Tony, the ballistic results come back.
And we actually got confirmation from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement that the guns collected that Tony had been in possession of matched perfectly ballistically to the rounds that we had recovered from our scene.
That evidence right there is one of the biggest things you could have in any murder case. You can find the weapons and find the person who has the weapons. That's major.
So now that we can put Tony, at least the guns, at the scene, that gave us the ability to change gears with Tony. We had the information and ammunition that we needed to confront Tony about what really happened.
Detectives head back to the jail to interview their prime suspect.
As Tony began to kind of spin his version of what happened to Ron, now he acknowledged having a little knowledge of it, but he said that he had loaned his guns to someone else and that he didn't know what they did with them. He didn't have any involvement in it. But what he says is that he had heard Ron was dealing drugs, and that's why he was killed.
We had already done a thorough background on Ron. We knew Ron was not involved in any drug business. We had talked to too many people. He was a happily married man trying to make it in life. That's what Ron was.
Then Tony gave us information that would kind of put us on some individuals that might be involved, and we tracked those individuals down, and we were able to confirm 100% that they had nothing to do with Ron's death.
People sometimes, when they are being questioned, especially when the police have some of the goods on them, will make up stories. And that's what Perez did. As far as the police could determine, that was a total concoction by Tony Perez.
Detectives believe Tony is lying, but wonder what motive he could have to kill Ron.
We were still kind of struggling to establish how Tony would have came into Ron's life.
Going through Tony's belongings, we found some cell phone bills there, and they were linked in the name of Kim Miller. Kim Miller turned out to be Tony's girlfriend, so we went to talk to Kim.
Kim Miller is the owner of a Panama City hair salon.
Tony and Kimberly, they had been in a romantic relationship for several months.
We were told by Kim that Tony, he was doing odd things for her. He would come around the hair salon and he would actually shampoo customers' hair, clean up, sweep up the shop, things like that.
Investigators look for a connection between Tony and Ron Stovall.
Kim was familiar with the Stovall homicide. She claims that she first heard about it because she had a customer that had called in and canceled her hair appointment, saying how her ex-son-in-law had been murdered.
When detectives ask Kim for the customer's name, they receive a startling response.
The connection kind of came out of nowhere and almost as a surprise.
Kim's client is Ann Trexler, who happens to be Tina's mother. Tina, Ron's ex-wife.
Police believe husband and father Ron Stovall was shot and killed by criminal Tony Perez. They're now exploring a potential link between Tony and Ron's ex-wife, Tina Trexler.
When Kim Miller indicated that she styled Tina's mother, Ann Trexler's hair, and law enforcement was pretty stunned by that.
Ann Trexler is the mother of Ron's ex-wife, Tina.
We knew of the ongoing hostilities between Ron and Tina. So when we talked with Kim Miller, we asked her if she had ever met Tina, his ex-wife, and she did met her on a couple of occasions. Tina's mother, Ann, however, was a regular client, was in there on a regular basis.
With Tina previously eliminated from the investigation, detectives ask Kim more about Tina's mother, 52-year-old Ann Trexler.
She told us that Ann's talking to her and telling her about these problems with her daughter going through this custody battle with her ex-husband. And she was upset about it. She's afraid she's going to lose her grandchild.
Ann had told Kimberly the Trexlers had to get a second mortgage on their home to provide legal assistance to Tina.
Could the custody battle be the motive behind Ron's murder?
At that point, we were trying to determine exactly who she was. She hadn't really been on our radar at all. We knew that she was Tina's mom. We knew that she was Tina's alibi at the time of this crime.
Ann Trexler, no criminal history, supposedly a wonderful grandmother and fine Christian lady who would never be involved in something like this.
Investigators contact Ron's wife, Angelica, and learn his custody dispute with Tina brought out a different side to his former mother-in-law.
Apparently they had a good relationship when Tina and them were married, but it was just a constant battle over visitation rights. It was just such a fight with her.
Looking to see if Ann could have anything to do with Ron's murder, detectives bring her in for an interview.
When we talked to her, she stated to us that there was no way that she had anything to do with killing him. She did not want him dead. Matter of fact, she said she loved him. And then Ann Trexler wanted a lawyer. And once they get a lawyer, you're done talking.
So we're kind of getting a heightened sense of concern as far as her involvement in the case, because she decided to basically not cooperate with the investigation.
Having hit a wall with Ann, detectives get a breakthrough when forensics results arrive.
We got confirmation that Tony's boot was consistent with the shoe impression that we had at the scene. Also, Tony had been in possession of the guns used. Now you've got a personal item putting him at the crime scene. At that point, we knew we had our shooter.
That's a big piece of evidence right there.
We were able to go back to Tony and present him with what we knew.
He admitted killing Ron. His very words were, "Okay, I did it." It's the shortest confession to a murder I've ever taken in my career.
Investigators push Tony to reveal how the crime unfolded, and what he tells them is shocking.
Tony told us that Ann Trexler wanted to have her ex-son-in-law killed and was willing to pay to have it done. When we found out Ann Trexler wanted to hire somebody to kill Ron, I mean, this is unbelievable. Ex-mother-in-law gonna get involved and have pay somebody to kill her ex-son-in-law?
He had met Ann at the hair salon. She was complaining about Ron, and that the two of them had worked out a deal for Tony to kill Ron in exchange for about $10,000 to be paid to Tony.
On November 10, 1998, Tony is charged with the first-degree murder of Ron Stovall. But the case is far from over. Detectives turn their attention back to alleged mastermind Ann Trexler. Searching for answers, detectives pull Ann's phone records.
The phone records were a treasure trove of information. They showed a lot of phone traffic between Kim Miller and Antonio Perez and Ann Trexler.
It clearly looks like Kimberly was the middle person between Ann and Tony.
There were phone calls between the Trexler house and Kim Miller at strange hours of the night for strange amounts of time that could not be explained away by saying, "We're setting up our rinse and set." Another thing, we were able to show that Ann Trexler received a phone call from Kim Miller the morning right after Ron's death. So there were links to tie Ann Trexler to this plot, but there was no hard, concrete connection of evidentiary value. We needed something else that would show that Ann, in fact, had hired Antonio Perez to kill Ron Stovall.
Tony Perez, he says that he had come to an agreement with Ann Trexler to kill Ron for $10,000.
Detectives scour Ann's financial records for any signs she had commissioned Ron's murder.
We have withdrawals from her bank accounts that coincide with when Tony says he was paid and the amount that he was paid. So now we have proof that what Tony's telling us is accurate regarding being paid. With regards to Ann, none of us had ever worked a case like this. So it was kind of a shock that all of these pieces were kind of lining up to support she is the motivation to this entire crime.
But we felt like we still could not make the case against Dan Trexler. We needed someone to corroborate what Tony Perez said. We needed somebody else that can draw the line between the money and the murder of Ron Stovall.
We have to go back to the middleman in the case, which is Kim Miller.
She's the whole key to this thing.
She was looking at criminal charges, but without her, we're not going to get Ann. She is the only way that we're going to have true accounts of what happened.
We went and picked up Kim Miller and brought her in.
Kim Miller, she stonewalled. She said, no, I'm not talking to you. I'm not telling you anything.
Investigators working the Ron Stovall homicide have charged shooter Tony Perez with murder and believe the mastermind is Ron's former mother-in-law, Ann Trexler. But to build an ironclad case, they need Tony's girlfriend and go-between, Kim Miller, to share what she knows. However, Kim is refusing to talk.
It really wasn't until we actually laid out in front of her the phone records and drew the lines between Ann and her and Tony that we were able to convince her to cooperate with the investigation.
We let her know, she was going to be charged with accessory to the murder, and she's facing life in prison.
Prosecutors offer Kim a deal, a reduced sentence in exchange for testifying against Ann Trexler. Eventually, Kim takes the deal.
Kim sang like a songbird.
Kimberly was very adamant that there was a deep-seated hatred for Ron on Ann Trexler's part.
She indicated that on many occasions, Van Trexler ranted and raved about Ron Stovall, how bad he was, that he was going to remove her granddaughter. She wished that somebody would take him out, and it got more and more. Finally, Kim said, okay, if you're really serious, I know somebody who might help you.
Kim lets her know that her boyfriend, Tony Perez, will get rid of him for $10,000. That's how the deal came about.
Kim then reveals how in the early hours of October 6th, Tony drove to the Stovall house to lie in wait for Ron.
About 3 o'clock in the morning, when Ron went out to his vehicle, Tony took a shot at him with a pistol. And Ron ran inside and slammed the door behind him, and Tony Perez fired more shots, which struck Ron in the back.
To finish Ron off, Tony tried to force his way inside the house.
Angelica, she tried to hold the door, and Tony Perez fired a shot that almost struck her. She ran to the other room to call 911.
Tony Perez came in, and he found Ron on the floor and walked up with a shotgun, said, this is for her. Boom. He killed Ron Stovall right there.
When he made the statement, this is for her, it's our belief that Tony was doing this on Ann's behalf.
Tony came there to do one thing, and that was to kill Ron Stovall.
Once he had made his getaway, he was able to reach out to Kimberly and make notice to her that, in fact, the job had been done. And then, of course, she notified Ann.
Kim swears Ron's ex-wife, Tina Trexler, wasn't involved in their murderous plan.
Law enforcement looked at Tina Trexler. Her mother, Ann, may have confided in her, but no one could get to that much evidence to put Tina in the situation of taking Ron's life.
Ann Trexler, she tried to be the grandmotherly type, but she planned this whole thing.
Ann Trexler's thought pattern was Ron Stovall is getting ready to take my only precious granddaughter away from me, and I won't have visitation, and he left my daughter, he married somebody else. He should not be able to get away with this.
From an investigator's perspective, Ann carried just as much weight as Tony. Without Ann, Tony would not have even known who Ron Stovall was.
On February 15th, 2000, Ann Trexler is formally charged with the murder of her former son-in-law, Ron Stovall.
And the cops called and he said, got her, she's in jail. She is morbidly evil. The darkest, blackest soul ever. And then she'll put on a face like she's just Miss Innocent. The killer, he didn't know Ron and knew Ron. I do not understand how somebody can have so much hatred in their body, in their mind, in their heart.
In court, shooter Tony Perez pleads guilty and is sentenced to life without parole. In February 2000, Kim Miller is sentenced to 5 years probation as part of her deal with prosecutors. Finally, in 2001, Ann's trial begins, and she pleads not guilty.
Ann Trexler took the stand. She testified about not being involved. She testified about her concerns of her grandchild and the fact that she had absolutely no involvement.
On May 14th, 2001, the jury finds Ann Trexler guilty of first-degree murder. She's sentenced to life in prison without parole.
There's a little piece. I'm in a little piece in this horrible thing. A little justice, I guess.
Gets a little emotional sometimes. It's not just me. You know, we're a whole team working this thing. We celebrated, I'll just say that. We celebrated this one.
The most striking thing to me is that these are all ordinary people. And it's a little bit frightening to think that people who are walking around living everyday ordinary lives would be capable of this.
The one that initiated it all was someone that if you passed on the street would look as innocent as they come.
For Ron's family, his loss continues to be deeply felt.
I miss him and I love him so much. My poor daughter, she never got the honor that she deserved. She never got her daddy. We celebrate his life all the time. He loved life. He loved to be happy. And I've tried so hard to keep his memory alive. Very much so. I will never forget how amazing Ron was.
A brilliant, free-spirited college student.
Barbara was very creative. She was always very theatrical.
I always thought she was a genius because everything came so easy to her.
Is found brutally murdered in a mountain canyon.
We could see 5 or 6 gunshot wounds.
There was some speculations that she had been sexually assaulted.
A clue left by the victim leads to surprising suspects.
He finds this note addressed to all the Mormon roommates that she was leaving to go be with her people.
Just how bad was this relationship with her roommates, and what could it cause anyone to do?
And a series of bizarre twists.
He's telling us that bullet holes were in a triangular pattern, and that's a sign of a possible Satan killing.
Somebody took her up there into the woods. This was potentially a sacrifice.
Until the evidence reveals a killer no one saw coming.
There was DNA from the soil that was underneath her body.
It was like finding a needle in a haystack, a big haystack.
It just didn't seem like somebody who would kill somebody.
It was just the biggest shock you could fathom.
Provo, Utah, a small college town in a picture-perfect mountain setting.
Provo sits in a county south of Salt Lake. It's where the Brigham Young University campus is at.
It's a very safe community. During the 1970s, Provo was definitely a place that was very low on crime, and you didn't have to worry about locking your doors at night.
That innocence is lost on a cold March afternoon in 1974, when a grisly discovery in a nearby canyon sent shockwaves through the community.
On March 11th, 1974, the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office received a telephone call from a power company worker who started walking up from the power plant. And as he was cutting through some brush, he came across a white female with gunshot wounds to her back.
The crime scene is essentially a couple miles up what we call Big Cottonwood Canyon.
Investigators race to the canyon where the utility worker leads them to the body.
We could see 5 or 6 gunshot wounds. All of them looked to be in her back or in her arm. The shot placements looked like execution-type shots, and it looked like she had been there for a few hours at least. With the way that her body was positioned, we felt like sexual assault was part of this crime scene. Her arms were tucked up underneath her. That told us that she was in pain, that she was fearful of what was happening to her. We're looking for things like drag marks, but the ground around the body was not disturbed.
It looks like where she was is where she was killed.
Detectives are struck by an unusual detail.
Her clothes were folded neatly and piled towards the top of her head.
We suspected that the victim was probably trying to buy some time. As she was being told to undress, she was stacking her clothes in this neat pile.
More evidence is revealed when they turn the victim over.
We found some possibly .38 caliber bullets that were recovered after they had gone through the victim's body. We also picked up some soil and logged it into our evidence room.
The detectives back in the 70s, they didn't have the DNA that we have in today's crime scene investigations. They focused on all kinds of trace evidence like the soil, fibers, hairs may link the suspect to that scene.
While the body is taken to the morgue, detectives interview their only witness.
The only thing we really knew at this point was a utility worker had found this body, and we were able to clear him fairly quickly, but we didn't know who the victim was. We didn't have any other real suspects to go with at that point. We got a hold of the local media, let them know that we had a white female, Jane Doe, that we were trying to identify. Later that night, we received a telephone call from the Brigham Young University Police Department that they had received a missing person report of a white female earlier that day. The missing person in Provo matched the description of our Jane Doe.
The missing person is 22-year-old student Barbara Jean Rocky, but police need a formal identification to be sure she's also their murder victim.
We made a phone call down to a couple of the guys that were hanging out with Barbara.
Jerry Hicker is the one that filed the missing persons report. Jerry is also a student at BYU, and he was a friend of Barbara's and some of her roommates.
Edward Fisher and Jerry Hicker went to the morgue to do an identification on our Jane Doe.
Edward and Jerry confirm the murdered woman is Barbara Rocky. Police now face the difficult task of informing her family.
At the time of Barbara's murder, my parents were living in California.
My mom found out first from the police and was crying, and from then on, nothing was the same.
It was just the biggest shock you could fathom. It's like what you knew of the world has just imploded.
Born in 1952, Barbara had an idyllic childhood growing up in Menlo Park, California.
Barbara was very creative. She was always very theatrical.
I always thought she was a genius because languages and music came so easy to her. Barbara was always rooting for the underdog. If somebody needed help, she would open doors for them. I mean, always doing something very sweet.
When the time came to go to college, Barbara's choice reflected a growing spiritual interest.
Barbara was always searching for a religion.
Barbara was interested in the Mormon religion. My parents were very happy for her to go to Brigham Young because they felt that she would get the safe group of friends and the good education and religion that she required.
When Barbara went off to college, she seemed up and happy and like things were going well.
Investigators asked Barbara's loved ones if they can think of anyone who might be responsible.
Since she was away at college and out of our supervision, we had no idea what she was doing. We just didn't know what kind of friends she was making.
In speaking with the family, they just had no idea on who could have done this to her.
With the family unable to provide leads, detectives hope her college friends might be able to point them in the right direction.
Ed Fisher was dating one of Barbara's roommates. When asked if he had any idea who would have done this to Barbara, he just had no idea. He felt Jerry Hicker might have more information about Barbara than he would.
Jerry Hicker is also a student at BYU, and Barbara seemed to spend lots of time with him.
Jerry described that he was just devastated that this had happened to Barbara. He knew Barbara very well.
Police asked Jerry what led him to file a missing persons report just hours before Barbara was found dead.
He said that he had gone skiing the day before, used Barbara's car to take the skis back, and then he met up with Barbara on March 11th at about 10 o'clock in the morning and gave the car keys back with plans to meet up later on to go grocery shopping. After leaving Barbara, Jerry spoke with one of Barbara's roommates, and then he went to study at the library. Later that day, Jerry and Barbara had plans to grab some food, but she didn't show up. As Jerry left the BYU campus, he walked past Barbara's house and he didn't see Barbara's car, so he continued towards his home. And as he was passing the Park Plaza apartments and sees Barbara's car sitting in the parking lot, which was someplace that Barbara would have never parked her car.
He said that was kind of odd, why it would have been parked where it's not normally parked.
Inside the car, he finds this note that was left by Barbara. It's addressed to all the roommates that basically said that she had found her people, that she was leaving to go be with her people. I think that he looked at it as a suicide note, and so he took the note over to the roommates, and that raised enough suspicion to report her as a missing person.
In order to clear Jerry as a person of interest, detectives drilled deeper into his timeline.
Jerry gave his timeline up until that evening, and essentially once he found that letter, he came and talked to us.
Jerry reported her missing, he found the note, he was cooperating with detectives, so he really wasn't somebody that fit as a suspect.
When detectives asked Jerry about any conflicts Barbara may have had, he mentions one unexpected source.
Jerry tells investigators that the roommates and Barbara kind of have an off-again, on-again relationship.
Barbara Jean Rockey lived with 7 other women from Mormon families. Barbara sometimes liked to do things for shock value, and this is not a place people go to shock others.
There was a little bit of intimidation between Barbara and some of the girls. Jerry said that things had gotten so bad that he had tried to find Barbara another place to live.
Was it possible one of Barbara's roommates could be the culprit behind her death?
Just how bad was this relationship that Barbara Jean Rockey had with her roommates, and what could it cause anyone to do?
Coming up, detectives uncover dark secrets.
The majority of the roommates were very religious.
He had a relationship with Barbara Jean and had been dating one of her roommates.
A love triangle could easily turn deadly when there's jealousy involved.
He had pulled a dagger on her and said he was going to stab her.
And links to a terrifying killer.
She described him as a great warlock and maybe even a devil worshiper.
There's women all over the American West that are going missing and being discovered dead.
This guy turns out to be probably the most famous, notorious serial killer of all time.
Until the evidence reveals the horrific truth.
He was not who we suspected, and so to learn that he was responsible for killing her was very surprising.
After 22-year-old college student Barbara Rockey is found shot dead, police have discovered she had clashed with her roommates and bring them in separately for questioning.
The roommates had only known her since January when Barbara moved into the house, and going to a predominantly Mormon school, Barbara really didn't fit that mold. She was from California, and she was more of a free spirit.
She was somebody who was very opinionated and was not a conformist.
Barbara Jean Rocky's roommates say that she was kind of dating around, not necessarily saving herself from marriage, and it was generally not accepted.
The roommates were very religious. They attended church faithfully. I think Barbara would probably experiment with different religions just to expand her knowledge, and at times would do things that would maybe scare them.
Barbara Jean's roommate said she was kind of into witchcraft, so she was attracted to that lifestyle a little bit.
They didn't want to be a part of Barbara's life, so they would keep her at arm's length.
Had one of Barbara's roommates lashed out and done something unthinkable?
Being more of the typical LDS BYU student, you just wouldn't think that somebody like that could kill somebody, but until you do the leather work on it, you can't clear them.
Detectives worked to verify the roommates' alibis.
Once the investigators corroborated all the stories and looked at the timelines, they were able to clear the roommates as not being somebody that had killed Barbara.
As detectives continue asking the roommates about Barbara, they learn some startling new information.
Investigators found out through the interviews of the roommates that Barbara would carry a .357 revolver pistol. Some of the roommates described Barbara as being maybe a little bit paranoid, where she would think people were following her.
In 1974, people weren't just walking around with guns the way they do today. So if a 21-year-old college kid was walking around with a .357 Magnum pistol, who was she afraid of?
Detectives get more surprises when they search Barbara's vehicle.
When the investigators looked in the rear of the vehicle and they found ammunition and targets, things that you wouldn't expect in a female BYU student's car. Did Barbara feel like she needed to have a gun? Did she practice with the gun? Was somebody after her? We weren't sure what all of that meant at that point. The car was fingerprinted, but there was just nothing of good forensic value that we could come up with at that time.
With more questions than answers, detectives turn their attention back to the note Barbara's friend Jerry had found earlier in Barbara's car.
They found a victim, shot multiple times, and then someone else finds this note in her car that says she's leaving to be with her people. And what's the purpose of this?
The investigators were wondering if the note was even authored by Barbara, so they do some handwriting analysis on it and send it out to have that done.
While detectives await results, the autopsy report comes in.
At that time, they came up with 6 bullet hole entrance wounds. The shot in the arm was probably the bullet that killed her because it went back into the chest and hit some vital organs. And the final wounds were when Barbara was turned over and on her stomach, and the entrance wounds were in her back.
Being shot in the back is a good indicator that the person is known by the assailant. He doesn't want to see their face when he kills them.
At the autopsy, the medical examiner took swabs of both her rectum and her vaginal area to try to preserve any evidence that might be there.
The autopsy report indicated no definitive evidence that she had been sexually assaulted.
With the autopsy offering no new leads, investigators turn their focus to any romantic relationships Barbara may have had.
They were talking with the roommates more about other men that may be in Barbara's life, and they came up with a guy named Richard. They knew that Barbara was very much infatuated with him. She spoke about him all the time, even called him her boyfriend.
As police focus on Richard, they make a disturbing discovery.
They had asked if Richard had ever been violent towards Barbara, and Barbara had relayed one story that Richard had pulled a dagger on her and said he was going to stab her.
This was not the only alarming story Barbara's roommates relayed to detectives.
About a month before Barbara was murdered, she reported that her gun was missing, and that raises all kinds of concerns. She reported it to campus police, and to my knowledge, she never got that gun back. A .357 revolver would have fit with the potential murder weapon that killed Barbara. She had expressed concern to her roommates that the person that had taken the gun may use that gun on her, and the roommates just kind of dismissed it. But now that Barbara was found shot to death, the roommates were concerned for themselves as well. Having that information, the investigators really wanted to find out who Richard was. At this point, all we have is Richard's first name. He's willing to maybe take a dagger and stab her.
We strongly felt that he could have been responsible for her murder.
Three days have passed since student Barbara Rockey was discovered shot dead in Big Cottonwood Canyon. And police are hunting a man named Richard, who they believe is her boyfriend.
This could be the person that killed Barbara, but all we have is Richard's first name, and so we're kind of running into a dead end.
With no way to identify their potential prime suspect, detectives catch a lucky break.
Out of the blue, a guy named Richard Finder calls into our department and tells us that he knew Barbara Rockey.
Richard Finder initiated contact, offering his services to basically try to help them solve this case.
First question we had was, is this the Richard that we've been looking for?
As investigators prepare to meet with Richard Finder, they learn everything they can about him.
We find out that he's in his 30s and he's a self-proclaimed psychic. He lived in California. Barbara was from California, so that was one of the connections that they had. We also found out that a .357 pistol was registered to him, which is obviously the same caliber that we're looking for.
Richard Finder arrives at the sheriff's office, and detectives begin by asking him about his relationship with the 22-year-old college student.
Barbara heard Richard Finder on the radio talking about the occult. Barbara had called into the radio station. They ended up exchanging phone numbers. Barbara had gone up to see him at his hotel, and I think Barbara at one point even felt that Richard was her boyfriend. Richard claimed that it was just a spiritual relationship, that he looked at Barbara not in a physical way.
Under further questioning, Richard mentions something that gets the detectives' attention.
The place that he was staying at was very close to the mouth of the canyon where it was that Barbara Jean was found.
Detectives cut to the chase and ask Richard where he was on March 11th, the day that Barbara was killed.
He tells them that he was in Salt Lake at the time of the murder. He said that he had gotten up and had some breakfast, and then he went over and helped a friend do some construction work on a house all day long, and then he went back home and went to sleep on the couch.
Detectives set to work checking out Richard's alibi.
The guy that Richard Finder was staying with did confirm that Richard was with him in the evening, but he could not confirm the times that Richard told us about during the daytime.
With holes in Richard's alibi, detectives dig deeper into his claims about his relationship with Barbara.
Our investigators talked to Barbara's therapist, and she just really got the impression that Barbara was in love with Richard.
The therapist reveals another way the relationship was less innocent than Richard made it seem.
Barbara described Richard as a great warlock and maybe even a devil worshiper.
I think that the satanic and the witchcraft, it's not too far-fetched to think, okay, somebody took her up there into the woods. This was potentially a sacrifice.
When police confront Richard with these allegations, his response is even more alarming.
He's telling us that he's having these dreams and that she was shot in the back in a triangular pattern, and that's a sign of a possible Satan killing or devil worship. Richard also told us that he had a vision that the murder weapon was also thrown into water. How would he know that we didn't have the murder weapon? So that really raised a question to us. We're wondering, is this guy confessing to us? Is he telling us about our crime scene? He has all of this knowledge. Is this guy the one that killed Barbara that day?
When you start putting all of these things together, it made Richard Finder a pretty good suspect.
Despite the circumstantial evidence stacking up against him, detectives need something more concrete.
So we collect all of his weapons for ballistic tests with the projectiles that we located from Barbara's body. We received the results from the ballistics test, and they were not a match. And that pretty much blew up most of our case with Richard Finder.
Detectives pin their hopes on the results of the handwriting analysis on the note found in Barbara's vehicle.
Maybe she wrote the note under duress. Maybe she was forced to write the note.
That could be a significant clue, especially if it's determined that our victim didn't author the note. It's like someone's writing a suicide note for someone else.
The handwriting analysis came back and it showed that Barbara was the one that had written the note.
The letter itself seemed to be a valid letter to her friends, and several people said that's Barbara's handwriting.
The investigators concluded that maybe Barbara was thinking about moving home and she was just explaining that in the note. At this point, we're starting to run out of leads.
As the investigation stalls, Barbara's family is rocked by another tragedy.
My dad would call the police practically every day when nothing was coming to fruition. And he died like within a year after she died.
It killed my father. And we had so many key relatives die, still wanting to know what happened to Barbara.
Detectives never give up on the case, and a year later, in 1975, they notice a disturbing pattern of crimes.
There's women all over the American West that are going missing and being discovered dead.
College co-eds with dark hair were found murdered, and the serial killer was certainly the big topic of conversation.
A surprising arrest changes the whole course of the investigation.
In 1975, a Utah State trooper makes an arrest west of Salt Lake City.
The suspect was arrested for a kidnapping case, and some of the evidence in the vehicle definitely could have had something to do with Barbara's murder as well.
The driver's name is Ted Bundy.
This guy turns out to be probably the most famous, notorious serial killer of all time. Is he the one that killed Barbara?
A year and a half after the murder of Barbara Rockey, the investigation is sparked back into life by the arrest of notorious serial killer Ted Bundy.
More and more that police start investigating Ted Bundy, the more connections they find to missing and murdered women all over the country.
In 1974, Ted Bundy was also in the Utah area, going to school at the University of Utah.
Barbara Jean fit Ted Bundy's profile.
She was a college student. She was a brunette, and she was the age that Ted Bundy seemed to target.
Ted Bundy had a reputation of being a very charming man. You know, he was a good-looking guy and was kind of a smooth talker.
Ted Bundy would act like he was hurt and ask for some assistance from a female, and that would have fit right with the personality of Barbara. She would have helped Ted Bundy if he had approached her.
With Barbara fitting the profile of Bundy's victims, detectives connect with the FBI.
The investigators were able to get a hold of a timeline that the FBI had prepared, find out what his whereabouts were on March 11, 1974. When the investigators looked at Ted Bundy's timeline, they found that he had an ironclad alibi for that day because he was in Washington committing another murder.
With Bundy cleared, the Barbara Rockey investigation grinds to a halt.
The investigators had done everything forensically that they could. They had done all the interviews that they could. They had looked at all the suspects that they could, and the case just went cold.
Once the case was cold, we pretty much accepted that it was not going to be solved.
When a case goes cold, it definitely affects the family every bit as much, if not more, than the investigator. They just want someone to be held accountable for their daughter's death.
The case lies unsolved for 30 years, while Barbara's family yearns for answers.
The hope and the drive to crack this case someday was powered by losing so many family members that were enraged and wanted justice. So we had nothing to lose by trying.
In 2005, Barbara's loved ones make one last push for justice.
I asked Mom, I said, do you want me to try to open this? And she said yes, because I need to know before I die.
I was a fairly new homicide detective, and my phone rang, and it was one of the family members saying, hey, my sister was killed back in 1974. Our mom's getting up in years, and she'd really like to know who killed her daughter.
The family would expect us to just do what needs to be done to solve their case, and you can't put a price tag on this level of justice.
Digging into the 30-year-old case files, detectives' attention is drawn to one suspect in particular, the self-proclaimed psychic, Richard Finder.
I was not convinced that law enforcement had closed the door all the way on Richard Finder.
I wanted to look into Richard further because the timeline to me wasn't rock solid. And I wanted to try to look more into the forensic end of it. DNA and the ballistic stuff has come a long ways since 1974. As I'm looking through each piece of evidence, I'm trying to figure out if that would have any forensic benefit to having tested.
While evidence from the original crime scene is sent to the crime lab, investigators dig deeper into Richard's version of events.
As I started looking at Richard's alibi, I spoke with some of the same people that the investigators had spoke with previously.
As we reinvestigated and re-interviewed these people, information that wasn't known back then was revealed.
What I learned was that Richard had been dating and seeing a friend of Barbara's, Janelle. But then Barbara also found that Janelle was getting closer to Richard Finder than Barbara was, and there was some animosity from what I understand regarding that.
I learned that sometime very close to the murder, Richard had left town with Janelle Bach, and Richard and Janelle became boyfriend and girlfriend, and that was kind of a blow to Barbara. That really kind of stuck out to me.
Janelle came back to Salt Lake for 3 or 4 days around the time of the homicide with Richard Finder, and they were staying at a house just west of the mouth of the canyon where Barbara was found.
Had Barbara confronted Richard about Janelle only for the encounter to turn fatal?
Because of this relationship between Janelle and Barbara, and because Richard Finder supposedly had guns, and then because of his witchcraft and the possibility of human sacrifice, Richard Finder was up there on the list as a potential suspect.
Investigators try to bring Richard in for another interview.
Unfortunately, we found that Richard Finder had passed away.
But really, the only avenue I had was to go talk with Janelle.
Was Janelle the only living person who knew what really happened to Barbara?
I didn't see any information in the case file where Janelle Bach had really given a good interview about Richard Finder, and so that was the place that I wanted to start.
Barbara was upset that Janelle had essentially taken Richard Finder. So when they came back, there's this potential triangle and some jealousy. It placed some suspicion on Janelle.
Anytime an investigation reveals some sort of a love triangle, that can easily turn deadly when there's jealousy involved, and all of a sudden, the whole thing shifts from one guy to the person that's least suspected.
Three decades after Barbara Rockey was found murdered in a Utah canyon, cold case detectives want to speak to Barbara's former roommate, Janelle, who had been dating Richard Finder, the psychic Barbara had fallen in love with.
Janelle was looked at because of this triangle and this dispute, and Richard Finder was aware that there was this jealousy.
Detectives want to know if either Richard or Janelle had the opportunity to kill Barbara.
They were back in Salt Lake for 3 or 4 days on a ski trip during the time of Barbara's demise, but they never went skiing. And they were staying at a place that was close to the crime scene where Barbara was found.
Janelle was able to give me a timeline that she was with Richard that day, and the hours that she wasn't coincided with the times from the initial investigation.
It was confirmed with others that she was very sick when she came up here. She didn't even leave the house, and she was being taken care of by Richard Finder during the time of the homicide and was not in that area.
Janelle Bach was able to give me enough information to make me feel that he definitely was not the killer of Barbara, and she was not a suspect any longer.
Undeterred, detectives scour through the files from 1974, looking for details the original investigators may have missed.
As I was going through the case file, Jerry Hicker's name kept popping up.
So Jerry's early role in the case was he was one of the last people to allegedly have seen Barbara Jean at about 10 o'clock in the morning.
He reported her missing, so he really wasn't somebody that they were looking at as having a role in her death.
They were really good friends. That came through in the investigation, but I wasn't satisfied about him not being a suspect.
Detectives reach out to Barbara's former roommates, asking them about Jerry.
Some of the roommates told me that, Jerry just didn't have a lot of friends, and Barbara was accepting of everybody. And Jerry just kind of latched on to Barbara, and I think Jerry had more romantic feelings for Barbara than Barbara did for him.
I think that the roommates kind of looked at Jerry as basically kind of a stray pet that people were taking care of.
He just didn't seem like somebody who would kill somebody.
When investigators dig into Jerry's life after Barbara's murder, they make a disturbing discovery.
Jerry had been accused of rape in the Provo area after Barbara's murder.
When I found that Jerry was arrested for a sexual assault, I want to know, could Jerry have been the one that killed Barbara? Barbara's roommate had been away from Jerry for a long time. In the interviews, I found out that Jerry really had an obsession with guns, and that he helped Barbara find the .357 that she bought. He took her out, showed her how to shoot the .357.
Jerry would always tell Barbara about how to load her firearm, leaving one of the cylinders in the revolver empty, and then looking back and seeing that Barbara was shot 5 times. Is that relevant in this case?
We actually looked at the ME's report, and we couldn't really determine if she had been shot 5 or 6 times. There was the opinion that it was 6, but it could have also been, through the re-entries and fragments, could have been 5.
As I'm going through these interviews and I'm listening to what the roommates are telling me, he was a rock-solid suspect at this point.
Detectives race to track down Jerry Hicker.
I went to Jerry Hicker's house in Washington. I explained to him that I was looking at the Barbara Rocky case. Jerry immediately said, you'll have to talk with my attorney, and that he wasn't going to give me a statement. So at that point, I had nothing else to do but leave.
With Jerry refusing to cooperate, investigators must find concrete evidence to link him to Barbara's murder.
We wanted to see if, with today's technology, that if there was a sexual assault, that there might be something suitable for DNA testing.
I was pretty excited to find that a vaginal and rectal swab had been taken on Barbara, because by now we were utilizing DNA testing, and I thought that I was going to be able to match those up with DNA that we got from whatever suspects were in the case file.
Investigators hope that the swab test results will point toward Jerry.
They didn't know about DNA in 1974, and they packaged everything in plastic. Because it was packaged in plastic, it ruined any DNA that was in any of the biological material that was taken. I was devastated. I thought I was going to be able to solve that case really quickly, but that's not what happened.
Fearing that the case will go cold again without solid evidence, investigators gamble on another way to obtain the evidence they're looking for.
I took items that had not been tested yet from the original evidence to our crime lab to have them tested.
The original crime scene evidence includes a soil sample from beneath Barbara's body.
I was just more or less taking the dirt out to have a sample taken in case some seminal fluid had migrated down into the dirt.
There was still the belief, based on the scene and everything, that there was a possibility of a sexual assault.
When I got the results of the test, surprisingly, we got a match that there was DNA from the soil that was underneath Barbara's body.
After 30 years, had DNA analysis finally identified Barbara's killer?
And what came back as a result of that testing was shocking.
It's been 33 years since student Barbara Rockey was found stripped and shot in Big Cottonwood Canyon, Utah. In 2007, DNA in a soil sample from under her body finally reveals her killer.
Finding that DNA in the soil was like finding a needle in a haystack, a big haystack.
The results come in, and we've got a match, and it's Jerry Hicker.
Just that little bit of information was all that we needed to link Jerry Hicker to this crime scene. He was not who we suspected initially. And so to learn that he was the one responsible for killing her was very surprising.
On November 6th, 2007, 56-year-old Jerry Hicker is charged with the first-degree murder of Barbara Rockey.
When I first found out that the killer of Barbara was Jerry Hicker, I was surprised because I heard that he was just sort of a guy from next door.
It was a shock. I never thought it would be solved.
As prosecutors prepare for their day in court, they piece together a theory of how Jerry killed Barbara.
So our belief of what happened was Jerry Hicker knew that Barbara may be leaving, because that next morning, and he was aware of the letter before he brought the car back.
I think what tipped him over the edge was he wanted Barbara sexually, and her rejection and her indication of leaving Jerry was more than he could take.
Hicker winds up talking Rockey into going up Big Cottonwood Canyon with this scenic view one more time before she leaves.
And when they get to this spot, Jerry's trying to put the moves on Barbara, and she doesn't want to have anything to do with Jerry that way.
Hicker takes out a gun, and in rage, he tells her to strip down, and she was probably folding the clothes in order to buy herself a little more time.
Barbara's pleading for her life. She's just trying to get anything into Jerry's mind to not do this.
And then he shot her, apparently while she was standing up. And then she went down, and then he shot her 4 times in the lower back region.
After the murder, Jerry tried to cover his tracks.
Jerry has to drive back to campus. He gets rid of the gun, and he's trying to come up with alibis. He knows he can't park the car right there at Barbara's house, so he takes it over to the Parkway Plaza apartments, and that's where he decides he's going to use this letter making her a missing person.
This was a young woman who trusted somebody. They're supposed to be going to a nice spot, and instead she's shot and murdered.
I felt so horrible knowing that she had gone through something like that. She was probably so scared. Nobody deserved to die like that. Nobody.
I believe that Jerry was being the concerned, loving friend, and that may have put some thoughts in the investigator's mind that there's just no way Jerry could have done this.
Beneath the facade just seemed to be rage and anger that he'd been rejected.
I think Jerry Hicker was a sexual predator. They got away with a lot of crimes.
We were so glad and so grateful that the detectives had worked so hard. It boggled my mind that they could solve it after 34 years.
Despite an airtight case against Jerry, his declining health leaves prosecutors with a new dilemma.
When I went to arrest Jerry, he had been diagnosed with cancer. He was just the shell of a man. We didn't feel that his lifespan was much of 5 years, if that.
So we worked out a deal that he would plead to a substantially reduced charge of manslaughter and that he would be sentenced to the prison for 5 years, figuring that that would be a life sentence.
Going with the plea deal was my mom's decision. She wanted him to say in his own words that he did it. She wanted those answers.
Jerry Hicker serves 3 years in Utah State Prison. And in 2014, 5 years after pleading guilty, he dies of cancer.
I bet you he had been looking over his shoulders all these years. I felt that his ill health was Barbara's justice.
This is somebody that wasted away not only his life, he ruined so many people's lives by his selfish act. Barbara didn't deserve this. She had so much ahead of her, but the family does have some answers. That's the goal in my investigation.
I think that in this case, justice was served and that the family got answers that they would not have otherwise had.
The thing I miss most about Barbara was the times that we used to blast Beatles music and sing and dance for hours and just being kids, you know? I remember her then.
Barbara was such a giving person. I feel inspired by her ability to give of herself. And I try to emulate that.
A vibrant young woman making a fresh start in life.
My sister had a great sense of humor. She was just full of life and ideas and fun. She had a new graphic design job, a new relationship, a new place to live. She was looking to a new future.
Is mercilessly slaughtered in her home.
The person slit her throat.
It was a shocking murder.
Whomever the attacker was extremely disturbed.
You just can't register it. She didn't have any enemies. Everyone loved her.
Investigators tracked down multiple suspects.
There was a creepy guy just watching her.
There was a note that said, saw no signs of life.
Then police discover an enemy in disguise.
They were using other individuals to try to throw us off.
It was a bombshell.
Detectives unmask a killer no one could have imagined.
And I said, what? It didn't make any sense to me.
I was in complete shock.
Gulfport, Florida is an idyllic community, complete with sun, sand, and seaside charm.
Gulfport is kind of a classic southern town. It's kind of an arty community now.
Gulfport has a beautiful beach, and people are very friendly. I never felt unsafe living there.
On May 24th, 1984, Gulfport's laid-back lifestyle is shattered when a disturbing discovery is made.
A woman was checking on her neighbor, and when she didn't answer the door, she viewed inside one of the windows and saw a body laying in a pool of blood. And that's when she called 911.
Homicide detectives are sent to the address in Waterview Park.
Entering into the residence, I noticed broken glass, and I saw the victim's body. There was a copious amount of blood pooling around her head. She looked like she had been hit with a blunt object. There were several stab wounds up and around her neck area, like it was an attack of rage. The victim was partially clothed in a black teddy over a white t-shirt.
It was kind of unusual for someone to wear a teddy on top of their t-shirt. It was unsnapped at the crotch,
And so I had suspicions that she was sexually assaulted.
Even though the area was so gory, she had no blood on the soles of her feet. And that was important because you could see bloody footprints, and it appeared to be a barefoot as well.
We surmised that the perpetrator stepped in the blood after the attack was over.
The scene is so bloody, it's not yet clear what exactly happened. The body is sent for autopsy while detectives continue surveying the home.
There was blood on the bed, blood smears on the drapes, and blood on the windowsill. Possibly the attack started in the bedroom area and then traversed over into the living room.
The trail of blood would indicate that she was fighting throughout. I think she was able to get away from her assailant and run through the house and open the door.
There was some blood and hair on the door, and it looks as though she was stopped, drugged back in, and then finished. Upon examination of the residence, we couldn't find any type of weapon.
The crime scene was indicative of a very involved struggle, yet there was nothing knocked over or in disarray in the house. Now, it's possible that could actually happen that way, but it's also possible somebody went back in and cleaned it up.
Police speak with the woman who found the body. She tells them the victim is her neighbor, Karen Gregory.
She said the victim's boyfriend, David, was at a conference in Providence, Rhode Island. David had not heard from Karen, and so he called and asked if she would check to see if Karen was okay.
Born in Albany, New York in 1948, 36-year-old Karen Gregory was a loving and kind free spirit.
She was the center of attraction at any gathering, and people just loved her. Karen had a great sense of humor. She was a really good artist, had a great eye. She was a smart woman and very clever and witty and talented.
Karen loved to seek out new places and was always up for an adventure.
She traveled a lot. She would go to Jamaica and explore. And I think her ultimate goal was to go to Jamaica and teach art.
Before Karen can make her dream move, a chance meeting in Florida changes her plans.
And then she met David. David was an interesting character and probably a match for my sister's wit. He was very clever, very intelligent. David was a therapist for PTSD Vietnam vets, and they were just a really good match for each other. They were probably almost a year into the relationship where she had been visiting enough and staying there enough that it was time for her to move in with him. This was a new beginning. She had a new graphic design job, a new relationship, a new place to live, and I think she was looking to a new future. She had just moved in with David the day she was killed.
Who would take away Karen's life in such a horrific manner, and why? Detectives hope clues at the scene will point them to the killer.
Well, we found the Village Voice publication from Providence that struck us as really strange because David was supposed to be up there at the time.
That newspaper actually was dated the day that Karen could have been murdered.
Was David really in Providence, or had he returned? Before detectives can contact David to question him, they find another lead outside.
A note was placed on the car. The context of the note itself was quite telling.
It says, "Came by, I have something for you," but there was no sign of life. Rather brief note. But obviously, the no sign of life would, send up a red flag.
The note is signed by someone named Peter, but there's no other information, so police have no way to track him down. Officers collect the note as evidence, as Karen's family is notified of her death.
The day I got the call was just a beautiful, warm day. This isn't the kind of day that these things happen on. They had found my sister murdered. And I said, what? It didn't make any sense to me. And my mind just went through all of these situations to make that call impossible. And everything will be okay.
Police ask Karen's brother, Roy, about her relationship with David.
Karen's brother indicated that there was a little conflict between Karen and David in that Karen may have had an interest in another individual.
In Jamaica, she met a guy, and then she'd stay longer and longer on these trips. I think she was kind of torn maybe between both realities and both futures.
We also found out that Karen and David had broken up for a length of time before her death.
It wasn't some huge breakup, and she was still moving in, so we assumed everything was going to be worked out. But the weekend she was moving in is the weekend she was killed. The murder was at David's house, and I knew there was a rift there. So I think that added to maybe, well, you know, you just never know.
Could he have flown out to Providence and rebooked a flight back to Gulfport, committed the homicide, and then jumped back on a plane? We have to track down David. We felt that something was there behind the scenes, and we needed to find out about it.
Coming up, investigators discover a series of suspicious men in Karen's circle.
He had been physically abusive to his first wife.
He made Karen feel very uncomfortable.
And scramble to separate friend from foe.
Here we are building on a story that really raised red flags for us. He's either protecting somebody or he's just flat out lying.
Until finally, the awful truth is revealed.
It makes me sick to my stomach.
No one would have ever thought that this person murdered this woman.
A day after 36-year-old Karen Gregory was brutally murdered in her home, police in Gulfport, Florida suspect her boyfriend, David Mackey, could have killed her, and they need to track him down.
Detectives found out that David was in Albany and that he had flew there to be with the family for the wake and funeral of Karen.
David Mackey seemed to be concerned about Karen, and he wanted to know what was going on. We weren't going to give David the investigative information that we had.
He said that he wasn't going to be back in Florida for another 2 weeks.
David promises to come down to the station when he is back in town. In the interim, investigators sent officers to canvass Karen's street.
Many of the neighbors heard a scream that night. Many got up and looked outside their windows and saw nothing. They didn't know exactly where it came from. Was it kids in a car? I mean, you know, they didn't really know.
The time of the scream was around 1 o'clock in the morning.
There's some thought the time of death was during the scream. She wasn't discovered until midday the day after that.
The head of the neighborhood watch is one of Karen's closest neighbors and a familiar face detectives can rely on.
George Lewis was a Gulfport firefighter, had grown up in Gulfport. All the police officers know him.
George and his wife, Linda, were very good friends with Detective Larry Tossi.
Well, having somebody like George to depend on was very, very comforting, in that if something was going on in the neighborhood, he was that kind of neighborhood watch guy. George said that he was working in his garage, which was across the street from the murder scene. He said he heard a faint scream. He had the radio up loud. He even went out in the street, didn't see anything.
But George did see something the day before Karen's body was found.
George Lewis described seeing this guy pull up in his car and walk up to the door and then write a note and put it on the windshield of one of the cars.
Did George see Peter, the man who wrote that note?
He didn't know Peter Clutt. It was certainly something that the police wanted to look into, because that was the only person they're aware of that went to the house during that time frame.
The next day, as police are figuring out how to track down Peter, they catch a lucky break.
In order to release the remains of the body, Karen's old roommate was asked to identify the victim, and at that time she brought another person with her.
And he identified himself. It was Peter Cumble.
Investigators bring Peter in to answer some questions.
I noticed the scratch on his hand, thinking, you know, maybe it was done by by Karen. He noticed me looking at it, so he moved his hand.
They asked him about that, and he said that his dog did it.
Peter confirms to detectives he is the one who left the note for Karen and says he was at the house around 7:30 p.m.
He had been invited to dinner by Karen. They'd known each other for maybe a year. They were both reggae music fans. He was bringing back a music tape, and that's what he was referring to when he said, "I have something of yours."
Not having anybody respond to the knock on the door, he just left the note and left. During the interview, he didn't seem very upset. Portraying that he was such a close friend to Karen, it kind of struck me as being, strange.
Detectives ask where Peter was when Karen was murdered.
Kumble's explanation for where he was that night was he was at home.
He did indicate that his roommate could verify that. He answered the questions, and he was amenable to whatever I asked him to do.
Peter provides police with his fingerprints and footprints, and while they let him go, detectives will keep an eye on him.
We weren't eliminating Peter Kumble from the investigation.
3 days after the murder, police received the medical examiner's report.
Karen had dozens of stab wounds on her. And it wasn't until they had cleaned her up they realized that the person slit her throat. Karen was tortured. The time of death was a day and a half before her body was discovered.
The report also confirms another disturbing fact.
The autopsy determined that a rape was involved.
The medical examiner found semen, but it wasn't enough to make comparison. And DNA at that time was in its infancy.
Thinking about what she went through, it makes me sick to my stomach. You just can't register it. She didn't have any enemies. Everyone loved her.
After 2 weeks out of state, Karen's boyfriend David returns to Florida and is immediately interviewed by detectives.
David was still very upset. He said he loved her and they were getting serious with each other, and she had finally found what she was looking for in life.
When detectives reveal they know he and Karen had issues, David brushes it off.
He repeated it was all good. They were in love with each other.
David claims the last time he saw Karen was the day he flew out of state.
Karen had driven David to the airport because he had a conference to attend in Providence.
Skeptical, detectives tell David they can place him back at the crime scene.
And I said, we found the Village Voice publication from Providence. It was dated, and I had a murder here in Gulfport. He indicated to us he had purchased the Providence publication to check on the weather before he had left. He told us it was at the newsstand in Gulfport a couple of days prior to the homicide. We have to look into that.
Detectives asked David point blank if he murdered his girlfriend.
He became frustrated, in my opinion, that we'd be looking at him instead of spending time looking for the real killer. He was pretty adamant in the fact that he was off doing a conference in Providence and he hadn't gone anywhere. He said, I want to be as much of a help rather than a hindrance as I can. He was also asked to submit foot samples, which he did as well.
When asked who might want to kill his girlfriend, David gives a name detectives recognize.
David informed us that he felt that Peter Kumble had some kind of an interest in Karen.
It became clear that David was trying to blame this on Peter Kumble.
Police are investigating the grisly murder of Karen Gregory. Her boyfriend, David Mackey, denies being involved and points detectives towards Peter Kumble, a man police have already questioned and released.
In David's mind, he felt that Kumble was someone who had an interest in Karen, like as a potential girlfriend. David wasn't aware of anything about Kumble being invited to dinner and really probably had no real reason to see why Kumble would come by the house while he was gone. He said that Kumble was an acquaintance, but not a close friend. They knew people in the same circles.
Peter Kumble was always calling Karen up and that he felt he was going to try to develop a relationship with her, and Karen obviously wouldn't have anything to do with it.
David was concerned that Cumble could be involved, and they needed to look at him closely.
With nothing concrete to link David to the murder, they let him go. Detectives now need to confirm his claim that Peter had ulterior motives around Karen. When police try to bring Peter in for another interview, they hit a problem.
He had left Gulfport right after his first interview.
He had went on vacation, and the detectives found that strange, that him being close to Karen Gregory, that he would leave and go on vacation after her death.
Without the evidence to compel Peter to return, investigators switch gears and delve deeper into David Mackey's alibi. David had told police he had given a presentation in Providence at 9 a.m. on May 23rd, which would have been 8 hours after Karen was killed.
Was it possible for him to have got on a flight, come down, murdered Karen, and got back up to Rhode Island?
Detective Sergeant Tossi decided to take flights in the same time frame. I found that he could have committed murder and get back in time and do his presentation. It would have been tight, but it's possible.
Detectives subpoena David's credit card information, but they show no record of David buying any additional flights. David's story about the newspaper also appears to check out.
It was discovered that the paper actually comes out 2 days early, and the gentleman remembered selling the paper to David Mackey. David was telling the truth, and his alibi was solid.
As weeks pass without an arrest, Karen's friends and family become concerned.
Not knowing why or who or how this even happened, you're left with all these questions. The grief was too heavy. There was just a lot of weeping for a long time. Just the slightest little memory of her or thought of her. I can weep right now thinking about that.
For such a small town, it was a shocking murder. I can only imagine what some of the women that lived alone in that community felt when there is a killer out there and they haven't been caught.
A few weeks into the investigation, detectives get a boost when potential suspect Peter Cumble arrives back in town.
He looked a little bit disheveled, he looked a little bit shaky, as if he didn't want to be there type of an attitude.
Detectives cut to the chase and ask Peter if he killed Karen Gregory.
He was completely shocked.
Cumble's alibi was he was at home.
But with David pointing the finger at Peter, detectives need to follow up.
He was pretty adamant in the fact that, you know, he hadn't gone anywhere and the roommate could be his alibi witness. Anybody can say they're home and they're in bed. In the middle of the night, they can go out and do what they want to do. And that's a very shaky and unsubstantiated alibi. We didn't have much to hold him at that point, so he left.
Needing something concrete to tie Peter to the murder, investigators hope his footprint sample matches the one found at the scene.
There was a partial bloody footprint on the floor. We did send it off to the sheriff's office. And we waited quite a period of time, and then we heard back that they couldn't find any identifying ridges or swirls. It's a big disappointment to me that our sheriff's office couldn't make a match.
Detectives refuse to give up.
The photograph of the bloody footprint looks mostly like a smear. So it was sent to Washington for the FBI to look at, which was not uncommon practice, especially if you had something that might be difficult for a local person to do.
The analysis won't be fast, so investigators go back through everything collected at the scene and find a potential piece of evidence.
There was a schematic drawing of a clock.
It appeared to have a blood stain on it. Did the murderer bring that with him and leave that there, forgetting about it? Did he get blood on it while this happened? So it looked like a pretty good clue they needed to follow up on. They were able to determine that these were schematics that had been drawn by Stephen Fischler, who was someone that Karen worked with.
Detectives send the blood on the drawing in for testing, and when they look into Stephen Fischler, they discover something troubling.
We found out from female workers that they felt uncomfortable around him. And he showed the girls pornography, and they took offense. They indicated they were afraid of him.
According to one friend, Stephen Fischler made Karen feel very uncomfortable many times. He made unwanted advances. At one time, he gave her a provocative novel that he was writing.
Fischler, as far as the way he behaved in the office around women, he was a suspect.
We decided that we needed to have an extensive interview with Stephen Fischler. Stephen Fischler had kind of a defensive attitude. He was curt.
He said that they didn't really know each other. He and Karen had seen each other at work, but she had only been working there a short period of time.
When Stephen was questioned about the schematic, he had no explanation for how it got into her house, other than she probably took it home with her.
Detectives grill Stephen about his reputation among his coworkers.
And he became angry. He says, I had no idea. We asked him if we'd take a polygraph test. He agreed to do that. Stephen didn't really want to answer the questions. He was extremely frustrated.
Just when investigators think they won't get anything out of him, Stephen says something truly shocking.
During the polygraph, he blurted out, okay, I did it. Everybody thought, well, heck, this guy is confessing.
Two months after Karen Gregory is viciously slaughtered in her home, her coworker Stephen Fischler has just confessed to police.
It was unexpected. Was he really telling the truth?
Police immediately begin to press Stephen for details behind his confession.
We determined that after talking with Stephen, that he blurted out, okay, I did it, just out of frustration. He was angry because he was being accused of this murder. And that was just his personality and his temperament.
Stephen retracts his confession and proceeds with the polygraph.
He passed the polygraph. It showed no deception indicated. The result was totally unexpected to us. It basically cleared Fischler.
But Stephen's not off the suspect list just yet. He refuses to provide a footprint sample, so police must wait for the results from the schematic drawing to see if any foreign blood is detected.
In this case, the blood was clearly all her blood, and it wasn't Stephen Fischler's. There was a lot of frustration. It kind of hit a dead end.
Running out of suspects, investigators switch up their approach and put together a behavioral analysis profile of the killer.
You're trying to look at, what causes people to do what they might do.
It wasn't your general whodunit. Whomever the attacker was extremely disturbed. He was the type of individual that had various fantasies, sexual fantasies, which drove him to commit the murder of Karen Gregory.
Maybe this was a serial killer, which kind of fits into that whole psychological pattern to some degree.
It was probably the most difficult case that I had to deal with. 5 months down the road from the homicide, I just couldn't let the case go. Couldn't put it on the shelf.
For Karen's family, coping with the reality that her killer may never be found is overwhelming.
We kind of thought they're never going to solve this, which was just alarming to us. And that's another whole kind of pain that was a nightmare. She was a sweet, wonderful young woman. And the killer was a brute, who butchered her.
Finally, a break comes in December, 5 months after the murder, when detectives make a discovery that revitalizes the case.
Tassi was talking to a person who lived a few blocks away from Karen, and that person told him they had heard the scream. She described it as just a wail, and that it was very disturbing. Tassi was like, he didn't realize it was really that loud that actually over 2 or 3 blocks people heard this.
This new information is in direct conflict with the statements of the neighborhood watch head.
She's several blocks away and she hears a scream, and George is right across the street. How come he didn't hear more than what he said was a faint scream? It didn't make any sense. So we figured we better have another talk with George, which we did.
Detective Tassi, he looked at George as a helper to the police case. George was a firefighter, the neighborhood watch guy that was actively out there.
When we went over his story, he indicated that he had heard the scream, and that he walked to the edge of his driveway, looked around and didn't see anything.
Now, George adds a new detail to his account.
Now he sees somebody on the lawn under the big oak tree. The story was quite a surprise. Why didn't he report it? Why didn't he call it?
He didn't really know what to say. I think in many ways he sounded nervous.
George describes the person he saw the night of the murder.
He said he was like 6'4" and had red sandy hair. He was a big, strong-looking guy. It was certainly something that the police wanted to look into.
Armed with the new information, detectives try to track down this mysterious man.
And in doing extensive neighborhood interviews, it was related to us there may be a peeping Tom in the area that fit. We thought, well, we may have something to go on here. I interviewed one person, and she said that she had a peeping Tom at her window. And when she noticed him, he took off.
Could the peeping Tom be the killer police have been looking for? Investigators show George pictures of possible prowlers.
He couldn't identify any of them. So the mystery man on the lawn remained unidentified.
So there's some thought that he might have been watching that house and watching her and knew that she was alone that night, and knew David was out of town.
I felt terrified, especially at night. I kept my doors locked. I didn't want to end up like her.
Detectives find another woman in the neighborhood who recently saw the prowler.
There was a creepy guy just watching her for some unknown reason.
She caught him peeping in the window, and he took off.
The woman recognized the man. When she tells police his name, they're stunned.
It was a big surprise.
Detectives hunting for Karen Gregory's killer learn there's a prowler stalking the women of Gulfport, Florida. Could the offender be one and the same? When a victim of the voyeur comes forward with a name, investigators are shocked.
It's the neighbor, George Lewis.
It was totally unexpected to us.
Detectives bring George in for a third time and ask him about the woman's claims.
He admitted he was outside the house, and he had some explanation for why he was there. He was a neighborhood watch guy and always looking out for people. He said he heard a noise or something. He thought, you know, is it possible it's the killer?
He was given the opportunity to take a polygraph test, which he did.
Detectives start by asking about the prowler.
Listening to the polygraph tape and how George Lewis described the man, I really believed him.
Investigators also ask him about the night of the murder.
Did you kill Karen Gregory? George said no.
The polygraph results tell a different story.
The results were disastrous. He failed it miserably. After he failed it, he had something else to say about the night of the murder.
George admits he hasn't been completely honest and tells police that's why he didn't pass the polygraph.
George Lewis indicated to us the individual that he saw on the lawn left Karen's house itself. He saw George and had approached him and threatened him. The person walks out and tells him, if you say you saw me here, I'll come back and kill you. So that's the reason he wasn't forthcoming. He was afraid of him. George Lewis went from just hearing a scream at the edge of his driveway to indicating that he saw the perpetrator.
And then his next story, George said this guy threatened him.
We were very concerned about that because here we are building on a story, so it really raised red flags for us. We felt that, you know, with the abundance of different issues and stories he was telling, he was using other individuals to try to throw us off. We had asked him to do a composite sketch of the individual that he saw. After the sketch was done, we both looked at each other and said, this really can't be happening. We both came to the conclusion it was George when he was younger.
I think he thought the police had a witness who saw somebody in Karen's yard. So he was making this description of the person who scared him get closer and closer to looking like him.
He's either protecting somebody that he knows, or he's just flat out lying. We have to look at George a little closer.
Investigators collect his foot and fingerprints, but with little hard evidence to hold him, George is released. Detectives take a deep dive into George's past and make some disturbing discoveries.
He had been physically abusive to his first wife.
According to her, there were times when he had been violent with her. He had choked her. The crime itself shows some pretty deep-seated violence towards women, and I think there was aspects in his background where you could see that.
George had gotten into a swingers club. That was a part of George I never really saw, you know, or never knew. He's never said anything like that to me. So that was kind of surprising, but things were building up with him and his behavior.
It appears George developed a troubling fascination with Karen before she had even moved in.
One of George's friends told me that Karen was visiting over at David's house. Karen had come out in a bikini, and he made some comment about liking to have an orgy with her. Got aroused. He had gotten into sexual perversions, if you will.
I think there was indications that he was, you know, a peeper of some sort.
Still looking for hard proof, detectives ask George's wife about the night of the murder.
She was woken by the scream. After just a few minutes, George came in from the garage.
The killer would have been covered in blood, but George wasn't.
When you sit back and you look at these things, could you say to yourself, oh, well, maybe he really didn't do it. Maybe his story makes sense. Or maybe he's covering up for somebody that did do it, you know what I mean?
And so now it's, you know, where do we go from here?
At that time, we didn't have, you know, DNA. The only thing that could tie itself into the case was the footprints.
Detectives are still waiting for those results.
It was getting extremely, extremely frustrating for the team.
And then the months just went by, you know, nothing happened.
It seemed like it was just going to be a cold case. And it's like, well, what are we supposed to do with that? You know, you can't just stop here, but they didn't have leads. They didn't know where to go with it. This is about my sister being butchered to death. We were not going to rest till they found who the killer was.
In March 1986, almost 2 years after Karen's murder, the FBI finally finished their analysis on the bloody footprint at the crime scene.
The day that the data came back from the FBI, everybody was elated. It showed the ridges on the heel from the bare foot, and they can be identified, compare one to someone else.
Detectives have renewed hope the killer is within their reach.
We must have sent 20 sets of footprints.
And they got a result on that relatively quick, which changed the whole case.
A definite match.
No one in Gulfport would have ever thought that this person murdered this woman.
Nearly 2 years since the brutal slaying of Karen Gregory, detectives have just received a report back on the bloody footprint found at the crime scene.
The footprint was sent to the FBI. We're waiting specifically on just that result.
There was a definite match of a footprint of George Lewis to the inked footprint that we had sent up there to the FBI lab.
It was shocking.
It was very hard for me to believe that George Lewis murdered Karen Gregory. He was the head of the Crime Watch. He was a firefighter. I was in complete shock.
Although no one could believe George was a cold-blooded killer, the evidence doesn't lie.
Footprints with their ridges and their swirls are similar to fingerprints. If you have enough of those patterns to present to a match, then they're just as good. I didn't want to believe it, and I had to face that. I trusted George. He was toying with me. He certainly wasn't the person that I thought he was.
The detective knows he has to ask his old friend some tough questions.
We asked him to come into the station, and that's when we confronted him with the footprint. That's when he said, I crawled in the window.
It was a bombshell. Now here's a whole new story where he's absolutely in the house.
He indicated that he had heard the scream. He had gone through the bedroom window to try to assist Karen.
He said that he saw her laying there with her throat cut open. Only the killer would have known that her throat was cut.
He said he had stepped in the blood to assist her or help her, and then he had exited out through the bedroom window.
His explanations didn't make sense. If you assume that his story is true, that he was threatened by this person in the yard and was too scared to do anything about it, then why would he go into the house?
Why didn't he call police at that time?
His story is BS, but the nail in the coffin, of course, was the footprint.
Investigators also talked to George's wife again, and they learned he would have had time to clean up after the crime.
His wife had been very defensive of him, but she changed the story. George was gone for the longest time, she said, 20 minutes or more.
We don't have to prove motive. We felt we had enough probable cause then to make an arrest.
I had mixed feelings. I was sorry it was George, but yet I was a little upset that he just led us on.
Nearly 2 years after Karen's brutal murder, on March 15, 1986, George is charged with first-degree murder and sexual battery.
It was a huge relief that they had finally found someone, but it was a shock, just a shock, and still no reason. Why would a neighbor do this?
I think in looking at him, it was pretty clear that he had a fairly misogynistic view towards women. He thought she might be an easy mark or an easy target.
At trial, investigators put forward their theory about how the murder unfolded.
George Lewis would have gone over knowing that David was out of town. He came in the house, knifed, and ready to do it, and was living out a fantasy. Teddy had been put on her against her will.
She knew that the only way to get away was fight to get out of that residence.
She was pushed and hit her head against the jalousie windows. That's when she screamed. After that, it got really violent. The rape was involved.
Lewis knew then that he had only one way to go with this, and as a result, he ends up stabbing Karen 21 times.
George Lewis maintains his innocence, but a jury convicts him, and he is sentenced to life without the possibility of parole.
No one ever really wants to believe that someone that is there to protect and to serve could do something so horrible.
This was really unexpected that he was the killer. That didn't seem like who I would expect a firefighter to be, and certainly not the neighborhood watch guy. Although maybe he was watching for opportunities.
I was relieved we could actually get justice for Karen and all the people who loved her.
There was a little bit of justice in knowing he was in jail. My sister probably would have forgiven him. That's the kind of person she was. It's funny sitting here now. She was alive for as many years as she's now been gone. She never lived, you know, we never got to know who she'd be as an old lady. She was just full of life and ideas and fun and humor. I have her ring on right now that she made for me. Karen and I were really close. And I'll always miss that. And I'll just never forget her.
A trailblazing local businesswoman, beloved by her community.
She was effervescent. She just had a glamour about her that was just unique.
She took pride in who she was.
Savagely murdered in her own home.
This person was so enraged that they just kept stabbing and kept stabbing and kept stabbing.
She had been hit in the head to the point that it actually had changed shape. We're looking for something that's got an edge on it, but that can snap bones.
Detectives uncover a trail of secrets and lies.
He couldn't explain things, and he failed the polygraph miserably.
What kind of animal is this person?
And chase a killer that stays one step ahead of them.
They fled to another country.
Until a series of stunning revelations leaves an entire town in shock.
Everyone was a suspect, and everyone was afraid.
Here comes some guy out of the blue telling us that he's the one who committed the murder.
You would think there's just a serial killer or somebody crazy running around.
I was like, how could we have gotten this wrong?
Two hours southwest of Louisville, Kentucky, lies the quiet town of Madisonville.
Madisonville, Kentucky is a small community. It's built on coal mines and agriculture.
It's a close, tight-knit community.
There's not a lot of crime in our area.
They call themselves the best town on earth, and for the most part, they truly believe that.
On January 13th, 2003, Madisonville police receive a call from an elderly man for a wellness check on his 85-year-old fiancée, Anna Mae Branson.
Her fiancé, Dr. Bob Fenneman, was afraid that she may have fallen or that she had had a stroke of some type.
He knocked on the door and couldn't get her to answer. And that's when he became worried. And he called Anna Mae's brother and the local police department.
An officer meets Anne's fiancé and brother outside her house. Finding a backup key under a bush, they enter the home to look for her.
The patrol officer went in one direction. Dr. Bob Fenneman was looking around, and Earl Winstead, her brother, went down to the basement. When he got to the bottom of the basement steps, he said, "I found her." It appeared at first though she could have fallen. But then upon seeing all the injuries to her body, it was obvious that Miss Branson had been murdered.
Homicide investigators are called to the scene and are shocked when they arrive.
Miss Ann was a friend of my mother's, and it was quite devastating. She was on her stomach. Her legs were extended. She had many, many stab wounds to her back.
She had been hit in the head to the point that it actually had changed shape.
Looking at the body, detectives start building a theory of what happened.
She had defensive wounds on her forearms, then she was knocked down. That's when the perpetrator really went to work.
Her head was facing the small chest type freezer. There was actually 2 types of blood spatter on the freezer next to her head. One was like a striking motion, and one was a golf type swing, where the spin-off from the blood spatter actually landed on that.
I can remember thinking that the perpetrator must have used 2 different weapons. The weapon was not only going through flesh and organs, going through bones, and was coming out on the floor underneath her. It was unlike anything that we'd ever seen or heard of before.
Why was this defenseless woman attacked so viciously? Detectives continue their search for evidence.
At the time, we didn't see anything stolen.
All of her large carat jewelry were on her finger and had not been touched.
The amount of damage she sustained suggests that the attacker was emotionally attached to her.
You think about someone leaving the area, dripping blood from, their arms, and not to find any blood on the door frames, handrails. It was surmisable that person had taken the time to clean up the crime scene.
But other than the evidence on the freezer and the amount of damage that she had sustained, there was no other real clues.
News of Ann's death spreads quickly in the small town.
I got the call that Ann had been murdered. And not just murdered, but unbelievably, brutally murdered. It's just something that you see on the news, but it's not real until it happens in your family.
I just felt like a ton of bricks had fallen on me. Having someone who was a second mother to me killed in such a horrible way is just overwhelmingly devastating.
Anna Mae Winstead was born in Madisonville on November 30th, 1917. And from the beginning, she stood out from the crowd.
Ann was effervescent. She just had a confidence about her, a glamour about her that was just unique.
Anna Mae was a very flamboyant lady. She had a zest for life.
In 1935, Ann married her high school sweetheart, Carol Branson.
When Anna Mae and Carol were first married, they were poor. During World War II, Anna Mae was a Rosie the Riveter, working on fighter planes.
But that was just the start for her. After that, she liked business, and she stayed in the business world.
In 1950, the hardworking couple used their savings to buy a Dairy Queen franchise.
The center of the town was the Dairy Queen, and everyone went there for date night.
Miss Ann, as a boss, was a demanding person, but she also made you feel like you were part of the family there.
They literally became multimillionaires through this Dairy Queen.
When Ann's husband, Carol, died in 1994, Ann was ready to take on a new business challenge.
She would get these older houses, and then she would make them fabulous, and then she would rent them.
Anna Mae was one of the most successful business people that I've ever known, even in her older age.
Ann was generous with her renters, and she was generous with her family. And everyone knew that they could borrow money from Ann, but they would have to pay it back.
Anna Mae was so much of a businesswoman that she kept a ledger with information about people that owed her money.
In her later years, family and business weren't the only things in Ann's life. Several months before her death, Ann had met retired eye surgeon Dr. Bob Fenneman.
Dr. Bob lived in Evansville, Indiana, about 50 miles from Madisonville. When she and Dr. Bob first started dating, she said, "Well, I've got a boyfriend." The very last thing that Anna Mae acted like was an old lady. When I found out that she was murdered, that just totally shocked me.
At the crime scene, detectives examined the rest of the house for clues.
There were no signs of forced entry into her residence.
Nothing was ransacked, like somebody was searching for something. We didn't have any idea who had committed such a violent act on an 85-year-old woman.
What kind of animal is this person?
While forensics continue their work, detectives speak to the two men who alerted police, her fiancé Bob and her brother Earl.
Earl was asked to establish a timeline for that Sunday, and he had provided an alibi where he was with family at the time of the murder, and the family did substantiate his whereabouts.
What about Ann's fiancé? Could he have had a reason to harm her?
A homicide of this magnitude, you need to ask who's in a relationship with this victim. When we interviewed Dr. Bob Fenneman, he was emotionally distraught.
Dr. Bob did ask Ann to marry him. She did accept his 3-carat diamond ring, but she had not set a date. They had talked about whether they would have some sort of agreement because she did have a lot of money, but she was kind of hesitant.
Police want to know, had Ann's hesitancy about Bob caused him to turn against her in a violent rage?
This person was so enraged that they just kept stabbing and kept stabbing and kept stabbing. To inflict that many injuries, this was a personal crime.
Coming up, buried secrets are brought to light.
We all thought he was a family man, thought he was a churchgoer.
She explained that her alibi had been coerced.
While detectives unearth suspects with violent pasts.
He had several assaults in his past.
We're starting to think, hey, you know, this could be our guy.
They had already stabbed another woman. We would never have dreamed who the killer was.
Detectives are investigating the horrific murder of elderly millionaire Ann Branson. Forensics suggests it was a crime of passion.
Dr. Bob, even with his age, we did feel could be a viable suspect.
Dr. Bob was from Evansville, and he drove all the time to Madisonville to court Ann. But she had not yet decided whether she was going to get married.
Had Ann's reluctance turned Bob against her?
Dr. Bob Fenneman was asked to establish a timeline and provide us with an alibi.
The day before Miss Branson was murdered, she had gone to Evansville, Indiana, to meet up with Dr. Fenneman to go to a dance. And after the dance, Miss Branson returned to Madisonville.
Sunday, he said he attempted to call her and she didn't answer the phone.
It was shortly before 10 o'clock that evening, and Dr. Fenneman said that he presumed that she had gone out or that she had gone to bed early.
So the next day, he said he became worried, and he said that's when they discovered the body at the bottom of the staircase.
Detectives learned from speaking to her family that Ann had been to an evening church service on Sunday.
Miss Branson's estimated time of death was on that Sunday evening after she returned home from church. Dr. Bob said that he was at home in Evansville, Indiana.
Taking no chances, investigators search his phone records.
Phone calls placed Dr. Bob in Evansville, Indiana, so he would not have been in the area during the time frame of the murder. He did not have the opportunity to murder her. It just wasn't feasible for him to have committed the crime.
After clearing Bob as a suspect, they ask if he can think of anyone who would harm his fiancée.
Dr. Bob recalled that her handyman, Wayne Shelton, had borrowed money from Miss Ann in the past, and the amount was more than what a handyman should be borrowing from his employer. Mr. Shelton also owed child support. He was trying to provide the court system a statement that she would guarantee his employment And Miss Branson did not feel that she could guarantee him employment. So she had concerns over it.
The fact that the maintenance man had a financial relationship with the victim made him a person of interest that we wanted to talk to.
Detectives contact Wayne Shelton and ask him to meet them at Ann's house.
Wayne Shelton came to the crime scene when we were there, and I explained to him the circumstances of what had occurred. He was extremely shaken. He was in disbelief.
Police cut to the chase and ask Wayne where he was on the night Ann was murdered.
His alibi was he was in another county visiting with his daughter during the murder of Ann Branson.
Knowing Wayne's alibi is weak, detectives take him to the station for a polygraph. But there's just one problem.
Wayne Shelton had a heart condition. It was so fragile that it kept him from even being able to take a polygraph.
So the polygraph examiner refused to give Mr. Shelton a polygraph.
Frustrated by this setback, Ann's nephew, Jack Branson, a retired FBI officer, pulls some strings.
Mary and I hired a retired FBI polygrapher, and Wayne Shelton said, yes, I'll be polygraphed.
Jack's polygrapher takes Wayne Shelton carefully through the test questions.
Wayne Shelton passed the polygraph with flying colors. So at that point, we were able to say, okay, he passed the polygraph. He did not do it.
As investigators search for new suspects, news of the savage murder puts the whole town on edge.
This had been a little town where literally people didn't lock their doors. And all of a sudden, everyone was a suspect and everyone was afraid.
The community needed to know if they had something to fear. So it was pressure all the way around to get this crime solved.
As word spreads, police begin to receive tips from the public.
We received a tip that there was a black pickup truck at the residence after 12 at night.
Could the black truck belong to the killer? Investigators ask Ann's family if they know anyone who drives such a vehicle.
We kept hearing about a crazy tenant that drove a black truck.
What detectives learn about Ann's tenant concerns them.
Robert Prince had characteristics of a mentally unstable person.
He would actually call her in the middle of the night and say that he had ghosts up in his attic, and would she please get rid of the ghosts?
Ann always said she was nervous around him, and she didn't like it when he came to the house, and he called her at all hours of the day and night.
Miss Branson had received several complaints from the neighbors asking that she evict Mr. Prince from his apartment, and she didn't want to move him from that location.
And the family would say, don't become so involved with him.
Had Ann's attempt to move Robert prompted him to attack her?
If Robert Prince was mentally unstable and became angry at her, could he have caused her death?
Detectives investigating the slaughter of Ann Branson have discovered she had been involved in a dispute with a volatile tenant.
Robert Prince would call Mrs. Branson at all hours, saying crazy things to her, wanting her to come over. They had warned her not to go over there by herself.
Due to his mental instability, he did pose a great concern for us to investigate.
Searching their database, detectives find alarming information about their new suspect.
Robert Prince was found to have had a violent criminal history. He had several assaults in his past, and he could express a lot of anger towards someone else.
Police obtain a warrant to search his home.
What we were looking for is the murder weapon. I'm looking for something that's got an edge on it, but that can snap bones and go completely through the victim's body. And I'm looking for any clothes. There's no way that the perpetrator did this without getting some of the blood on himself. But we weren't able to locate any of the items that would be of interest to us in this case.
Despite the lack of physical evidence, detectives bring Robert Prince into the station for questioning.
When he was taken from his residence and interrogated, he did not want to answer any questions to do with his prior criminal history. And upon initial confrontation with Robert Prince, he was extremely agitated.
As he starts talking, we're picking up on his violent tendencies. We're starting to think, hey, you know, this could be our guy.
Detectives note that Robert's right arm is injured.
Even though he's a man that could inflict this kind of punishment, he can't bend his right arm. And we asked him, so you right-handed or left-handed? He said, I'm right-handed.
Detectives wonder, could Robert have hurt his arm attacking Ann?
He said he was in another state at the estimated time of death for Miss Branson.
Robert Prince gave the alibi that he was with some family in Tennessee and that he had stopped in a convenience store and got some gas and got a soda or something.
With nothing concrete linking Robert to the homicide, police have to let him go, and detectives get to work checking his alibi.
We contact that convenience store, pull surveillance video, and lo and behold, there's Robert Prince on camera.
And in addition to that, prior to Miss Branson's murder, Robert Prince had surgery to his elbow area and his arm, and according to his doctor, if he had inflicted those injuries upon Miss Branson, then all of his staples and his stitches in his arm would no longer be intact. So the alibi and surgical area just ruled him out as a suspect.
Back at square one, detectives are relying on the autopsy to break open new leads.
The autopsy revealed that Mrs. Branson was stabbed about 97 times throughout her body. Her skull was pulverized. She was beaten so badly that a lot of the stab wounds were actually inflicted after she had passed away.
The evidence technician said that we're not talking about just a regular old steak knife. It's something that's very heavy because the blade is going through her bones, through her organs, and was coming out on the other side.
While the autopsy fails to identify an actual murder weapon, it gives a clear estimate of Ann's time of death.
There was a pot on the stove, which she had baked her supper. She had eaten. We were able to analyze the food in her stomach, and based on the absorption rate principle, the time of death for her was approximately 30 minutes after she got home from church.
It was determined that her time of death was between 7 and 7:30 p.m.
As police continue their search for the killer, Ann's family struggles with her death.
Mary and I walked over to Earl's house to see how he was dealing with the grief. And his son, Russell, took us in to see Earl.
The whole family was in shock, and everyone was just questioning who could have possibly done this.
Earl and Russell, they were both saying, we'll be glad when we found out who did this. And we understood that was exactly how we were feeling.
As the family grieves, Madisonville residents question whether their town really is the best town on earth.
When the town found out that Miss Branson had been murdered, it scared a lot of people because you would think there's just a serial killer or somebody crazy running around to have done that.
This is Madisonville, Kentucky, coined best town on earth. You cannot have an unsolved murder of one of its most prominent members. It can't happen.
As detectives contemplate their next move, an unexpected tip sends the case in a new direction.
We're day 4 or 5 into this investigation, but we have nothing strong yet. And then we get a phone call.
That was the pivotal turning point.
The caller is a local mine worker named Jeff Hibbs.
Jeff Hibbs has some information about one of Anna Mae's nephews, Russell Winstead.
That phone call basically shocked and rocked our investigation.
5 days after the bloody murder of 85-year-old Ann Branson, police are contacted by a man named Jeff Hibbs, who makes a stunning allegation.
Jeff Hibbs believed that Russell Winstead had some involvement with the murder of his aunt, Anna Mae Branson.
Russell Winstead was known as a coal miner, a hard worker. He had 3 sons. He was married to Terry Winstead. It was known that he and his family attended church regularly.
Jeff claims that Russell has a secret unknown to his family.
Jeff Hibbs told us that Russell Winstead had an extreme gambling addiction.
He also tells detectives that he'd gone gambling with Russell a few nights before Ann's murder.
Russell told Jeff he had gotten a loan from his aunt that he had to repay by Monday morning, and that he had $9,700, and he lost every single penny of that money.
Russell told Jeff that they're all going to know about his gambling addiction because his aunt is going to expose him for borrowing money from her on a regular basis and not paying it back.
Jeff tells police that on Monday, the local headlines grabbed his attention.
Jeff Hibbs reads about this old lady that got murdered in Madisonville.
And he was like, oh my gosh, this is the aunt that Russell had to repay by the first of the week.
Detectives go back to Ann's house to search for evidence.
On our second search, I found a ledger and the large amount of loans that was written down for one nephew. They totaled up almost $100,000. The day before her murder, she had actually written down that he had received $9,700 from her and that he had paid her a check for $12,000.
Detectives believe that Russell had given Ann a check in hopes of winning enough at the casino to cover it. But when the check is nowhere to be found, detectives subpoena his bank records.
Upon the financial investigation, it was determined that Russell was basically shifting money around to cover the loans from his aunt. And the missing check for the $12,000 never cleared the bank.
10 days after the homicide, detectives interview Russell Winstead.
Even when we told him that Miss Branson had put it in her ledger, Russell still denied any knowledge of that check. He denied having any involvement in this whatsoever. At the time of death, Russell explained that he had gone to church and that upon leaving church, he had dropped his children off at his ex-wife's house, and then that he was at home in the basement.
Russell said he got home about 7:25 p.m.
With Ann's time of death estimated between 7 and 7:30 p.m., detectives interview Russell's wife, Terry, to verify his alibi.
Terry's explanation for Russell was down to the minute.
She said, yeah, we went to church. We drove separate. He dropped his son off at his ex-wife's house, and then he got home 7:25.
Russell had a solid alibi. His wife told the exact same story he did as to where Russell was on the night of Mrs. Branson's death.
There's just one loose end for detectives to tie up: Russell's casino visits.
I asked, you know Russell gambles, right? And she's like, yeah, I know he gambles. I was like, on a bad night, what do you think he loses? And she's like, I don't know, 2,000 or 3,000. I was like, try 38,000 on one night. And then she started bawling.
This was just devastating to her because she trusted Russell.
That same day, police get a search warrant for Russell's home.
We didn't find the murder weapon. We didn't find any clothes that were bloodstained. But we did recover a couple of burner cell phones that his wife didn't know even existed.
One of the cell phones was only used to contact a waitress at one of the casinos.
Russell had a girlfriend who worked at the casino.
So We talked to the waitress, and it alarmed us somewhat that even after he's a suspect of interest in a murder case, Russell was still continuing to go to the casino, still trying to be the high roller.
Russell has plenty of secrets, but do money problems and infidelity make him a killer?
Russell's father, Earl, told me the police are trying to jam Russell up because they need a suspect and they want to solve this case.
When we found out that Russell had been living a literal double life, we were shocked. But we felt that there was no way Russell had not done this. We believed it with all of our hearts.
But as they dig deeper into Russell's gambling, detectives find evidence of a man out of control.
We come up with a total of 236 times that Russell had visited a casino in the last year, losing hundreds of thousands of dollars in that time frame.
When it's rolled up into one, you're just like going, who is this guy?
The scope of Russell's betrayal prompts his wife, Terry, to kick him out of the house and return to police with a damning admission.
Terry explained that her alibi had been coerced.
She said that Russell is the one that told her what to say.
She explained that Russell actually did not come home around 7:30 p.m., that it was more like 9. So that put him as being a person that could have committed this murder.
Investigators obtain a warrant for Russell's arrest, but when they go to bring him in, they're in for a shock.
Russell Winstead had fled the country. We were very concerned that he would not be brought to justice.
When I found out that Russell Winstead had fled, it was my goal to get him, no matter what the cost, manpower, what it took.
The prime suspect in the murder of Anne Branson is her nephew, Russell Winstead. But before investigators can make an arrest, Russell goes on the run.
For Russell to have fled the country, it was shocking to all of us.
An innocent man doesn't flee like that. This is the last straw, and he has to come back.
I have never been a person that takes waiting very well, and our son came up with the idea of putting this case on America's Most Wanted.
If you've seen Russell Winstead, please call our hotline tonight at 1-800-CRIME-TV.
They aired the show February of '05, and then in May of '05, Russell was spotted at a casino in Costa Rica.
He was living under a pseudonym. He was still bouncing from female to female, and he was living the lifestyle that he attempted to live here.
We knew where he was. We wanted justice.
There's just one problem. With Russell facing a potential death sentence at home, Costa Rican authorities refuse to hand him over.
Costa Rica will not extradite anyone to the United States where the death sentence is a possibility. And also, they have gambling. So Russell had done his homework big time.
While investigators strategize how to get Russell back to Kentucky, they make a troubling discovery.
We found out that Russell's father, Earl, had been providing Russell with monies for his lifestyle in Costa Rica.
We had a guy come forward that said that Earl was actually paying him to wire money via Western Union to Russell in Costa Rica. We believed Earl was actually aiding and abetting Russell's flight.
With Earl sending his son proceeds from the estate of the person he murdered, it basically rubbed salt in the wound. It turned your stomach.
Investigators set up a sting to catch Earl red-handed.
So we wired this guy up as a confidential informant. and he met Earl, wired the money, and we got Earl doing that 2 or 3 times.
It was verified that Earl was sending money to Russell in Costa Rica.
While investigators find no evidence that Earl was involved in his sister Ann's murder, they arrest him for helping his son evade justice.
It really struck all of us by surprise. The thought that Russell Winstead's father, Earl Winstead, was sending money down to live on in Costa Rica just sat like a burr under a saddle with me.
I remember Earl being led out in handcuffs because he was arrested for helping a fugitive. But what really hurt us deeply was the fact that we knew it was Ann's money that was paying for her murderer.
Earl eventually pleads guilty to 7 counts of hindering apprehension.
He was placed on probation for 2 years, and if he contacted Russell at any point during those 2 years, then he would have to serve jail time.
While Earl faces legal trouble at home, federal authorities move in on Russell in Costa Rica.
Russell was observed at the gambling casinos. They felt that that was probably the safest place for them to take him into custody. So as Russell was leaving the gambling casino in Costa Rica, he was apprehended.
He was arrested in May of 2005 in Costa Rica. We did not get him back to Kentucky until February of the following year. Extraditing someone back from another country takes a lot of time, and federal authorities had to make assurances that we would not seek the death penalty against Russell.
It took us 7 months to extradite him back to the United States.
To know that it was taking this long was very hard. In fact, every time we'd visit a cemetery where Emma's buried, I'd say, we're gonna get him. We're gonna get him. It was a long, slow process.
Finally, more than 3 years after Ann's murder, Russell Winstead is returned home to face trial for the murder of his aunt.
That day I'll never forget. I went back to Anna Mae's grave and said, we got him. And I felt like a burden had been lifted because we knew what justice was going to be done.
Upon Russell's return to Kentucky, we were preparing for a trial when we got another humongous bombshell as far as our investigation is concerned.
Someone who was also charged with murder of an elderly lady came forward saying that he was the one who had killed Mrs. Branson.
All of this evidence has been stacking up against Russell Winstead. And here comes some guy out of the blue telling us that he's the one who committed the murder.
The confession is contained in a letter posted from Hopkins County Jail by an accused murderer named Fred Roulette.
Fred Roulette basically gives detailed information on the murder of Ann Branson that was never publicly made known. He stated that the murder weapon was a Bradis hammer. It is a mining tool, and he advised that he had modified that.
Fred Roulette provided a drawing of Mrs. Branson's home, and it was eerily accurate.
He gives all of these details that only the killer would know. I was like, how could we have gotten this wrong?
Police have arrested Russell Winstead for the brutal murder of his aunt, Ann Branson. But now accused murderer Fred Roulette has confessed to the crime, leaving investigators reeling.
Fred Roulette was also charged with murdering an elderly lady. So you think, oh my gosh, did we get it wrong.
It was completely devastating. So we were determined we were going to find out the circumstances of his confession.
Investigators throw all their resources into checking the validity of Fred's confession.
Fred was a drug addict, and he could not provide the details of the murder and robbery that he himself had committed to the level of detail that he provided about Mrs. Branson's case.
When investigators check the jail records, they discover a telling detail.
Fred did not come forward until after Russell had been extradited back to Kentucky, and Fred Roulette and Russell Winstead were cellmates.
Already facing 25 years on a separate murder charge, Fred Roulette insists to detectives that he killed Ann Branson.
Fred didn't realize until we told him that if he wanted to confess to this murder, it now packed a death penalty. After Fred heard those words, he was like, oh, no, game's off, gig's up.
That's when he told investigators that he had all the intimate details of the murder from Russell Winstead. Fred Roulette was promised that his family would receive compensation. Since he was going to be in prison for the additional murder, so Fred Roulette agreed to take the false confession.
With Russell's deception exposed, his trial can proceed. In July 2007, 4 years after Ann's murder, a jury hears what really happened on that Sunday night in January 2003.
Mrs. Branson had loaned Russell upwards of $100,000. And Mrs. Branson notated in that ledger was that she had received that $12,000 check from Russell on Saturday. As partial repayment of the loan, Russell had a large sum of money that he lost in the casino, and he made mention that he needed to pay back to his aunt on Monday. Russell knew he could not make good on that $12,000 check.
I believe that Russell Winstead was so desperate that he went over and he attempted to talk Miss Ann into tearing up the $12,000 check. When that didn't work, I believe that he lost it and that he snapped.
And that's when she started receiving all the damage to her, the 65 plus stab wounds to her back. We still do not know to this day how many times Anna Mae Branson was hit in the head.
He cleaned up the crime scene, and he felt that he could get away with murder.
The person that ended up being the killer.
When they announced the verdict, relief washed over me like Niagara Falls, a relief that this jury saw through Russell Winstead, and he did not fool them.
Finally, Miss Ann got her justice, and everybody who loved and knew her got a form of justice.
I miss Ann every day. And finally, I can think of her without thinking of her murder. I can finally think of her for who she was. Beautiful, beautiful part of our family.
Anna Mae took pride in who she was. I think she'd be happy to be remembered as someone who enjoyed life and had a good one.